Hello and welcome to the first episode of Anatomy of Austria-Hungary. As always, we are joined by Columba. Hello.
Good to be here, gentlemen. This promises to be your cherished subject, so I expect a lot of enthusiasm.
And Marcus Pertinax, how are you, sir?
Not too bad, thank you, and good evening, everyone. To second Columba, looking forward to another deep dive in Austria. So this is going to be fascinating. Ready for it.
Absolutely wonderful, everyone. Just one quick note before we carry on with this stream. Regarding super chats, I have recorded all the missed super chats from the last stream, which I'll read out towards the end. And regarding super chats in general, I've worked out a system whereby hopefully I'll be able to read all of them. I won't go into details as to how, but yes, if I do miss one of your super chats, there's still an issue with the YouTube see all button. But without further ado, we'll get into describing what Anatomy of Austria-Hungary is. So essentially, all of the other series that Columba and of course Marcus, since Nations of Charlemagne, have done, is to start off, in the beginnings of time, essentially, and catalogue the big origin of all these great nations, whether it be European civilization broadly, or whether it be, the Roman Empire, Byzantium, whether it be France, etc. In this scenario, we are going to be trying something a little bit different. We are going to be getting rid of all the major sort of events now in this stream. We will be offering a complete overview of Austria-Hungary from the beginning. So we're talking like the 15th century, although we'll get into depth around the 18th century, and we'll end at the death of Franz Joseph in 1916. And after that, in the subsequent streams, we will be going over each of the individual localities of Austria, and we will really going into depth in terms of, I mentioned in this introduction, which you can read down below, that this is inspired by Fernand Braudel's Identity of France. What I mean by that is we're going to be looking at geography, we're going to be looking at the longue durée, we're going to be looking at historical continuity, regional identities, all of these little facets all across all the individual crown lands of the
I think it's quite an appropriate comparison because from my admittedly brief readings, AJP Taylor, he makes that comparison, that the Estates Generals were never called in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I suppose is a bit crude, but it's certainly it's interesting to think about the history of France in that regard, which was of course very separated in terms of identity, and it had this coagulation that perhaps we didn't see in Austro-Hungary.
Absolutely. And of course, the diversity of Austria-Hungary is much more profound, which is why I think it's even more interesting to look into this effect. And unlike all the other streams, of course, we're going to be splitting this series in half. The first half is going to be dealing with the actual time period leading us into Austria-Hungary. And in the second half of this series, we'll be starting during the collapse of Austria-Hungary, and we'll be taking us through all the way up until the beginning of the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe in the 1940s. And what we're going to be assessing is the enduring legacy of all of these institutions, what you can refer to as the Habsburg effect, which if you go and look it up, even today, studies have been done where you can still see sort of more faith in institutions and trust in government if you lived in the former parts of Austria-Hungary, say in Poland or in Ukraine, as opposed to former parts of the Russian Empire, so to speak. So we're going to be talking about the endurance of these localized structures, this ancient societal structure, this continuity of empire, so to speak. So without further ado, I would like to define what Austria-Hungary is. Now, in terms of, obviously the first thing anyone will be aware of is that Austria-Hungary is not a nation state in the way that we can construe it today. Austria-Hungary, from my understanding, is a state founded on the idea of Hausmacht, or the power of dynasty, the power of the house. And in this sense, it could be referred to as a composite monarchy, i.e. the fusion of all of these historical principalities in the person of a single monarch, essentially.
Could you use the word feudal, a sort of feudal culmination?
Well, the difference between a feudal culmination, take France, for example. France as a feudal construct existed within a defined, basically a historical nation, which is France, which is created as West Francia after the Treaty of Verdun. And from 843, all the way up until the French Revolution, there is a concept, there is an idea, there are institutions associated with France. However, with Austria starts out as basically one constituent of the Holy Roman Empire. And over the course of its existence, as we're going to illustrate, Austria straddles, control over Eastern Europe. It straddles all of these other empires, such as the Hungarian kingdom, such as the Kingdom of Bohemia, expanding into the south, the former provinces of the Venetian Republic, etc., Bosnia. After the partitions of Poland, you get Galicia, Lodomeria. These regions, which, unlike France, don't have any sort of historical continuity in terms of overriding institutions, but historical continuity in the fact that they belong to the same monarch. They belong to the person of the Habsburg ruler. And in
of
terms
course,
of
the Habsburgs being one of the most famously powerful dynasties of all time,
Absolutely.
One could argue that with another dynasty, such a thing wouldn't have even been conceivable.
Absolutely, and this is an element of this. I mean, in terms of composite monarchy, of course, these were common throughout the medieval period. For example, looking at ancient Spain or ancient Aragon, Spain consisted of the Kingdom of Castile, it consisted of the Kingdom of Aragon, it consisted of the Kingdom of Sicily, consisted of the Kingdom of Sardinia, etc. And Poland, of course, was a composite monarchy between two principal constituents, that being Poland and that being Lithuania, and also at times Livonia as well. However, what distinguishes Austria is that Austria is this and so much more. Austria is the remnant of the Holy Roman Empire beyond the existence of the Holy Roman Empire. And in this sense, it is the last sort of imperial remnant of Catholic Rome, which carries up all the way up until 1918. And after the dissolution of the empire, you have the dissolution of even the concept of a Catholic emperor in Europe. So of all the composite monarchies, this is, I would say, by far the most historically distinguished of all the composite monarchies.
The Habsburgs themselves, besides their power, they almost take on this sort of mystic role, at least in the minds of some, as a sort of defenders of Christendom, be it against the Turks or the French, or I mean at times they work together, as we know. So
Yes, and I've tried this on another stream, but I think this is quite a good thing of just illustrating the, you can say, the territorial diversity of the nature of the cosmopolitan monarchy by illustrating the title of Franz Joseph up after the compromise, after the Ausgleich in 1867. So I just read that out. Franz Joseph I, by the grace of God, Emperor of Austria, Apostolic King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, King of Dalmatia, Croatia, Slavonia, Galicia, and Lodomeria, and Illyria, King of Jerusalem, Archduke of Austria, Grand Duke of Tuscany and Krakow, Duke of Lorraine, of Salzburg, of Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, and Bukovina, Grand Prince of Transylvania, Margrave of Moravia, Duke of Upper and Lower Silesia, of Modena, Parma, Piacenza, Guastalla, of Auschwitz, Sator, Tischen, Friuli, Ragusa, Zara, Count of Habsburg and Tyrol, of Kyburg, Gorzia, Gladzica, Prince of Trent and Brixen, Margrave of Upper and Lower Lusatia and in Istria, Count of Hohenem, Feldkirch, Bregenz, Sonnenberg, Lord of Trieste, of Kotor, and over the Vindicmark, and Grand Voivode of the Voivodeship of Serbia. So, in terms of
wait, King of Jerusalem.
Yes. Now, this title. Well,
this
is a very
contentious claim.
Yes. Now, this is a title which had been gained by many royal houses, and in terms of like where this comes from, it is the imperial connection to the title of King of Jerusalem comes from Frederick II's Stupa Mundi. And without getting too much into depth, the title of Kingdom of Jerusalem is...
because didn't they intermarry with the Baldwins or something?
More so than that. Frederick II reconquered Jerusalem. So, so that is, it's a legacy of that ancient title of wedding the imperial crown with the Crusader Stupa Mundi. So without further ado,
and also a legacy of contention with the Turk, I'd imagine.
So as mentioned by the, you can say the huge sort of composite nature of the monarchy, the amazing sort of diversity in all of the provinces held under the care of the emperor, there is very little in the way of linguistic unity. So say, for example, this is the 1910 census. Austria was the second largest empire in Europe in terms of, geographic significance. It had the third largest population in Europe. It had a greater population than France at the same time. In terms of around 51 million. the percent of German speakers was only around 23%, of Hungarian speakers only 20%. So this is called Austria-Hungary. But if you associate Austro-German, then the two principal ethnic groups within the empire together didn't even have a majority of the population.
Yes,
After
things are very nebulous in terms of languages. I mean, I even read somewhere that apparently some of the Croatian nobility were fond of speaking Latin. Until you had sort of the uprise of Magyar nationalism and what have you.
Yes, and this is something we'll get into. With Serbo-Croatian 10%, with Czech around 12%, Polish 10%, Ruthenian, the antecedent of modern Ukrainian, around 8%, Romanian 6%, etc., etc. And then, of course, Italian being the last of these significant language groups. However, in terms of like a unifying, you can say, force behind this empire, the vast majority of the empire are Catholic, and this is again the legacy of the Counter-Reformation, which we'll get into. However, there are significant Protestant, significant Orthodox, and of course significant Jewish populations at the same time. So the empire is incredibly diverse, incredibly complicated.
And we should also note that within the Protestant denomination, we also have, I think there are Lutherans, there's also Hussite influence from for centuries, so it's very complex.
Yes, and the different various confessions in Hungary. So without further ado, we'll quickly introduce all of the historical backstory, getting us to Austria-Hungary, if that's all right. So is there any point you want to start off, Columba?
I would just point out that, of course, the Holy Roman Empire was elective, and then you had the interregnum. We had lots of chaos, but it was elective, and the house in charge could change. But then, for reasons that I'm not 100% on, perhaps you could clear up for our listeners. Maximilian I establishes sort of Habsburg domination over the imperial title, and it becomes hereditary.
Yes, now it's not quite as simple as that. It happens a little bit before that. So you mentioned the interregnum, you mentioned the fact that the imperial position was elective. Of course, we have a stream, the Great Interregnum, where we go over this in detail. And don't worry, we're not going to spend 2 hours just getting to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, hopefully. But put it very simply, the Habsburgs rise to prominence through their marriage with one of the last pre-Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors, Sigismund of the House of Luxembourg. Through him, Albert and later Ladislaus inherit Hungary, they inherit Bohemia, and they inherit Austria. However, this is a false start in many sense. Albert dies, and Ladislaus doesn't have his control over Hungary and Bohemia confirmed. So it is Frederick III, the uncle of Ladislaus, who becomes the first crowned Holy Roman Emperor from the House of Habsburg, even though the first elected Holy Roman Emperor is Rudolf, going all the way back to the 13th century. So Frederick III rules for a very long time. He rules technically as Holy Roman Emperor, he rules only, I think, from 1454 onwards, or 1452, sorry. But he was elected, 10 years prior to that date. And from this, he rules over the Holy Roman Empire for some 50 years, even though he was also called the arch sleepyhead of the Holy Roman Empire for his incredibly cautious politicking and his completely lackluster military record. Nevertheless, regarding someone in the chat, someone in the chat has just picked up Frederick III von Habsburg, Holy Roman Emperor.
Is it not said that an uneventful reign is a good reign? That's what they always say about Antoninus Pius.
Yes, and of course he is famous for you can say the motto, which is very prescient in terms of the ambitions for the House of Habsburg, the AEIOU. There's a German translation, there's a Latin translation, but essentially it means all the world is subject to Austria, albeit there have been many different interpretations of it. It's a device which is created by Frederick III. Now, the legacy of Frederick III, obviously he is inherited by Maximilian. The Holy Roman Empire is never hereditary. What the Habsburgs are able to achieve is where they essentially monopolize the entire election system of the Holy Roman Empire, all the way, with one exception, which is Charles VII, which is during the reign of Austrian succession.
I suppose it's not de jure, but it's de facto for a long time. They have a total monopoly on the title. I mean, besides from these few exceptions that you mentioned.
Yes, and the significant element of that, we mentioned, we mentioned in our interregnum stream, that a papal coronation was essential in order to legitimate an empire. Well, after Charles V, this formality is basically abandoned in terms of advocating that the Habsburgs are seen as the natural holders of the imperial title thereafter. So during the reign of Maximilian, the empire expands into Burgundy. After the death of Maximilian, his grandson Charles V, inherits Spain, which is then Castile and Aragon. He is ruler over the Netherlands. He is ruler over Burgundy. He is ruler over Austria.
And we shouldn't forget, of course, that Spain is at the height of its power, dominating pretty much the entire New World. And so Charles V is an incredibly powerful and wealthy figure.
Yes, and he inherits the empire right at the beginning. I think Cortez takes over the Mexican Empire in 1517, and Charles becomes king as an infant, essentially, because his mother is Joanna of Castile is insane. So once he reaches his maturity and once his grandfather Ferdinand of Aragon dies, he inherits all of these individual, you can say composite nations, and this is why composite nature of the Habsburg Empire is essential. The fact they're not ruling over a single empire, the fact they are inheriting all of these individual empires which come together through the person of the Habsburg emperor. In this case, it's Charles V. So Charles V, of course, is the emperor, said upon which the sun never set. He's also the first emperor who has to contend with the Reformation, which is the first major attack on the authority of the Holy Roman Empire within Germany itself. And this is a consistent theme we see with the Habsburgs, is that while they consolidate all these colossal dynastic possessions outside of the empire, the actual authority within the empire itself, within Germany, continually diminishes throughout the same time.
And this is a constant contention. You see some emperors or some rulers in Austria want to move east. You see some and their attention moves back west, and usually the ones whose attention moves back west, things don't go very well. I mean, pretty much in every case.
Yes, and of course the significance of Charles V is that Charles V does not leave the entire empire to one son. During his lifetime, although he is Holy Roman Emperor, he partitions the eastern half of his empire, the Austrian half of the empire, the Archduchy of Austria, to his brother Ferdinand. And in 1526, the Hungarian and Bohemian king is killed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Mohacs. And in 1527,
and he was the last of the dynasty, right?
He was the last of the Jagiellon dynasty, even though the Hungarian and Bohemian thrones were elective. So the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand is then elected as the King of Bohemia and the King of Hungary in 1526 or 1527. And that is where we have the first continuous line of Habsburgs ruling from 1526, albeit there was a contended rule all the way back in 1440 with Albert and Ladislaus. And this is where we see the Habsburgs breaking into two branches. So the Spanish branch which also rules over Burgundy, most of Italy, including Lombardy, including southern Italy, including the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sicily, and of course the Netherlands to the north, are going to be partitioned and left to Philip II of Spanish Armada fame, whilst the eastern half of the empire is going to attain the rank of Holy Roman Emperor and control these eastern possessions, the Archduchy of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. And this situation, endures for the next 150 or so years. During that time, we have the rise of France. The Spanish Empire begins to decline vis-a-vis France. You have the 30 Years' War in Germany, which destroys much of the population and also destroys the religious unity within the empire.
Yes.
However,
something like a third of the German population or the third of the men in Germany died in that war. Something absurd,
Yes, it's absolutely severe. However, the empire is one of the the bulwarks against Protestantism on the one hand and against the Turkish encroachments on the other. As you can see on this map, the Ottoman Empire is still a major force, and the Ottomans and the Austrians will be fighting on and off wars for roughly around 300 years. Marcus.
I was going to say, in this grand strategy sort of context, it's the Austrians who find themselves sort of stuck between this Protestant Ottoman sandwich for several centuries from this point onwards.
Well, not just the Protestant Ottoman sandwich, but also the French sandwich as well, because the French
the dastardly French sandwich.
Which is ironic. You mentioned the 30 Years' War, where the French, ostensibly a Catholic power, basically unites with the Protestant North to sort of check the Austrians throughout and the Catholic League in this context.
So, in quick summary, what you can argue is that the 17th century is the unraveling of the Habsburg possessions in both Spain and Austria as the local superpower in Europe, not just of Europe, in fact, of the world. And by the end of the 17th century, Spain and Austria are significantly weaker, and France and indeed the Turkish Empire are, growing, at rates and bounds. However, regarding the Austrian house, this is where we get into talking about the Habsburg monarchy proper. The Habsburg monarchy is a historical device which is created basically for ease of reference when referring to the possessions around Austria, the possessions in
because
Bohemia,
really
the
it's just a
possessions in
sort
Hungary.
of it's just a sort of grand collection of huge variety of different possessions which are sort of slowly coalesced.
Yes, and that again sort of indicates how this isn't, again, a unified empire of unifying structures. These are dynastic possessions who happen to be held by the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, who was also a Habsburg. So things come to a head in 1683 when the Turks under Köprülü Pasha, they attack Vienna in 1683, and as a result of Austria, its Catholic allies, including Jan Sobieski of Poland, the Turks are decisively defeated, and the Austrians, of course, are under the command of Eugene von Savoy. And all of Hungary, which are basically, at least 2/3 of Hungary, the central part of Budapest, have been occupied by the Turks since the Battle of Mohacs intermittently. Transylvania was essentially a semi-independent principality, although it claimed to be, the legitimate king of Hungary under Ottoman rule. All of these areas in the span of roughly 30 years, in what's called the Great Turkish War, are lost to the ever-expanding Austrian Empire.
The momentum sort of swings in the Austrians' favor after the failed siege.
Yes. So at the end of this Great Turkish War, the Austrians have taken over all of the former lands of the Kingdom of Hungary before 1526, the so-called lands of St. Stephen. They've also expanded into modern-day Wallachia, what was then called Wallachia. They've expanded into northern Serbia. They've expanded into Bosnia. Then you have the death of Charles II, the Bewitched, because of,
yes, El Hechizado, yes.
the incessant inbreeding between the Habsburgs.
He has what in Scotland we would call a muckle chin. but AM, would you like me to just previously, because it might be worth mentioning, but in the sort of preceding period throughout the the earlier half of the 1600s, we had a very interesting situation in Bohemia, where upon the accession of one of the new Habsburg kings, the Bohemian.
Very quickly. Ferdinand, I think it's Ferdinand III of Austria. His reign was contested due to his overt, zealous Catholicism, and the Bohemian estates, because of course Bohemia was still technically an elected monarchy,
and still very influenced with Hussitism,
and had a large Protestant contingent, elected a Bavarian, a Wittelsbach from the Palatinate, Friedrich the Winter King, to come and become the king of Bohemia, and this is what starts the 30 Years' War, essentially. And very early in that war, in 1620, we have the Battle of White Mountain, whereby Ferdinand and the Habsburg Catholic forces annihilate the Protestant Bohemian forces. And
yes, because I believe the English king at the time, James I, the Protestants called on him for aid. They called on the Calvinist League for aid, but they got negligible support, and so they were thoroughly trounced at the Battle of White Mountain.
Yes, this is
and many of the Czech landholders were pretty much replaced, because I mean from what I know, in the 30 Years' War, it went on for so long and that things were so desperate that you had mercenary adventurers and mercenary companies and dislodged nobles all over Europe, and many of them came to fight in the sort of Catholic League against the Hussites, and as a reward many of them were settled on the lands of these Czech nobles who were turfed out, and some of these men were Austrian in descent, but some of them were Spanish, and there were even some Scottish nobles, if I'm not mistaken, who managed to get themselves landed on some of this land. So it's a very long and very severe war, and it has a deep consequences for the composition of the nobility
and the composition of the power structure of Bohemia vis-a-vis Austria. Essentially, this is the great humbling of Bohemia, and you can say the fundamental nature of its government changes from a elected monarchy into a hereditary principality of the Austrians hereafter, albeit this idea of independence, this harkening back to the independence of the lands of St. Wenceslaus or the Bohemian crown, is something which will play a very important part down in the 19th century.
Yes.
So
and now you also had the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, and from what I understand, this sort of at least nominally guaranteed some of the independence of the German states to the west, but also enshrined Habsburg control over Austria.
Yes, well, in terms of like enshrined Habsburg control over Austria, the Archduchy of Austria, was ruled by the the Habsburgs all the way until the 13th century. So that isn't so much in contention. But in terms of them,
yes, they're more recent acquisitions, we might say.
Yes, absolutely. So quickly moving on, we have, as I mentioned, the Great Turkish War. We've had the death of Charles II, the Bewitched, in Spain. And of course, the result of this is that the Spanish Habsburgs die out. And to make matters worse, the French have been essentially willed the throne of Spain by the Bewitched due to the Habsburg connection with Louis le Grand, Louis XIV. So from this point, this precipitates the so-called Austrian War of Succession, carving out basically the fate of the Habsburg Empire, wherever all of Spain and all of its possessions, notably modern-day Belgium, the Spanish Netherlands, Lombardy, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, all of these possessions would either go to Austria or go to France. And the end result was effectively a compromise, partly because there were two sons of Leopold. One was Joseph and one was Charles. Joseph was supposed to inherit the Austrian Empire, and Charles was supposed to inherit the Spanish Empire. Joseph dies in 1711, which means the British withdraw their support, believing that they would just be uniting a super empire under the rule of Charles, which of course is the reason they got involved in the war to begin with. So Spain itself, just Spain, is left in control of the Bourbon grandson of Louis XIV, who would then become Philip V of Spain, and he would begin, drastic measures in terms of centralizing, reforming Spain in imitation of France. Whereas in Austria,
and thus the Spanish Bourbon monarchy, which still continues.
Yes, with a couple of brief exceptions, nevertheless. But
yes, a couple of quite notable exceptions.
Yes, but sorry, Marcus, go ahead.
No, I was going to say a nomination of one Prince Leopold, which doesn't actually go through.
Nomination of Prince Leopold. Oh, you mean the Charles VI? I mean, he lands in Hello.
Oh yes, I'm here. Sorry.
Sorry. What do you mean by that precisely?
Oh no, when Bismarck attempted to place a
yes, sorry,
and triggered and tried to trigger war with France. Like I was going to say, that's one exception. It didn't end up going through anyway. Didn't end up happening.
The difficulties of covering a 500-year period, eh, gentlemen?
Quite. Yes.
So anyway, getting into a more manageable period of time, this gets us to Charles VI. Now, Charles VI is in a dire predicament because the Holy Roman Empire and many of Germany's lands had maintained something called Salic law, by which only the male could inherit, essentially. Male inheritance through the male line. So even a male couldn't inherit through a maternal succession like you had in England with absolute primogeniture. Male preference primogeniture. When we get to Charles VI, both Charles VI and his predecessor, Joseph, only had daughters. There were no sons. And it didn't look as if there were going to be any more sons. So from the beginning of the reign of Charles VI, we have the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, whereby Charles goes around to virtually, all of the individual diets of all of this, massive composite monarchy in the Austrian half of the empire, which now includes Naples, Lombardy, and modern-day Belgium, which had been acquired from Spain during the War of Spanish Succession, and basically to ratify the fact that his daughter, Mary Theresa, would inherit after his death.
Yes, but it also, if I'm not mistaken, because when you had the sort of rebellion in the West and the war over the succession, of course, the Habsburg forces were quite taxed, and so many of the Hungarian nobles saw this as an opportunity and to sort of try and reclaim their independence and rebelled. and there was a compromise, I think the Peace of Zodmer, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And amongst other things, the Hungarians had an interesting institution called the Komitat, which was essentially local gentry, not great nobles, but local gentry would sort of have autonomous rule and sort of local rule, and this was explicitly preserved in this compromise. And these sorts of things were also rolled into the law, if I'm not mistaken, Ian.
There were individual pragmatic sanctions for the individual components of the empire. So the main pragmatic sanction was in 1713. There was a Czech sanction in 1712. And the sanction you're referring to is the pragmatic sanction of 1723, dealing specifically with Hungary. And of course, you mentioned the minor nobility, but it's also the preservation of the powers and privileges of the Hungarian Diet, which had existed for hundreds of years at this point. And this is very pivotal for getting into what we're talking about. But of course, the other feature of this is not just internal recognition of the pragmatic sanction, but it's also international recognition of the sanction, because Austria straddles so much of Europe at this point that the inheritance of a female, and you have to remember that Charles putting his daughter Mary Theresa on the throne was incredibly controversial from a dynastic point of view, partly because Joseph had two daughters, which by any measure of primogeniture, had preeminence over Mary Theresa. One of those daughters had married into the Wittelsbach family, and one of those daughters had married into the Saxon royal family. So both of those, in this case, would be the Elector of Saxony and the Duke of Bavaria, had a legitimate claim on the Austrian Empire, without this sanction, essentially. So the sanction was essential to head off any potential claimants taking over all of these, vast Habsburg possessions.
And to also preserve the sort of Habsburg character, I assume.
Well, this is, again, a fundamental aspect of it. What Charles is doing is that Charles is trying to create some sort of unified inheritance that can be passed on to his daughter. This idea that all of these territories have to be acknowledged as some sort of legalized inheritance is quite revolutionary up until this point, because the issue of succession had been guaranteed by a constant slew of males, essentially. So this is where you can say, the creation of, what historians refer to as the Habsburg Monarchy, because it begins to have a legal continuity, a legal composition, in the sense that we have all these pragmatic sanctions. Nevertheless, I would say Charles VI is probably one of the most inept of the Holy Roman Emperors, because he makes all of these concessions in order to get the ratification of the pragmatic sanction. Just for anyone who's interested, the Austrians had set up their own international seas trading company in Ostend in Belgium. And one of the concessions from Britain in particular, not to go to war against Austria, is to shut down this potential competitor to the East India Trading Company. So many major concessions were given as a result of this. And to make matters worse, in the last decade of Charles VI's reign, he gets involved in a series of very costly wars, which effectively, lose Austria vast amounts of territory.
Now, these are the Silesian Wars, are they not?
No, this is before. We have the War of Polish Succession from 1733 until 38, in which there is an Austrian claimant and there is a French claimant to the throne of Poland. The French claimant is defeated. The Austrian claimant is put on the throne of Poland. However, during that same time, a Bourbon prince, Don Carlos, later Charles III of Spain, has taken over the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south. So he's lost control of southern Italy already. Then we have the Turkish War. Now, after the great success of the Great Turkish War with Leopold and Joseph, it was expected that the Ottoman Empire basically been severely militarily humbled and wasn't nearly the same threat it had been, say, for example, 100 or 200 years ago. This was proven to be a complete lie in 1737, because the Austrians attacked Turkey and the Turkish are able to expand into Austria. They reclaim parts of Serbia, they reclaim parts of Bosnia, and they reclaim parts of Wallachia, leaving Austria roughly with the borders that you can see on this map here. So Austria, right on the eve of the death of Charles VI, when the pragmatic sanction is at its most critical, has become bankrupt, and it has lost these series of wars. And here we have the death of Charles VI and the inheritance of Mary Theresa. Now, Mary Theresa, even with this pragmatic sanction, could not inherit the Holy Roman Empire. There was no pragmatic sanction for allowing female succession to the position of Holy Roman Empire. So the assumption was that her husband, Francis of Lorraine, would become the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, this is not what happened. Instead, you mentioned the hereditary nature of the succession. Well, this is the exception. Charles VII von Wittelsbach, who was the grandson of Joseph I, the previous
And he was
Holy Roman Emperor.
the Prince Elector of Bavaria, right?
Yes, he was the Duke and Prince Elector of Bavaria, is elected as the Holy Roman Emperor, basically with French backing, because the French use this as an opportunity again to form an alliance. They form an alliance with Prussia. Prussia, of course, marches south with Frederick II, and it seizes control over one of the richest provinces in the Bohemian crown, that of Silesia. Essentially,
and the French move into Bohemia as well at the same time.
The French occupy the Austrian Netherlands throughout most of this time as well. So this is a critical point for you could say the survival of the Austrian Empire. And this is why I contend that Charles VI is one of the most inept monarchs of the Habsburg Monarchy and Holy Roman Empire, because there was the prospect that without a male successor, the entire empire could have simply disintegrated were it not for Mary Theresa. And you mentioned the Hungarian connection previously, Columba. Well, this, of course, is completely crucial here, because she is able to win over Hungarian support by basically allowing Hungarians all their privileges and rights, so long as they support her claim to the throne. And this is crucial. She leaves the Hungarian constitution alone. She doesn't attempt to reform Austria's relationship with Hungary. Hungary and its ancient privileges and rights are preserved under Mary Theresa. And as a result of that, they fight and they help her retain her throne, not just in Hungary, but in Austria and in Bohemia as well. So, and of course, the Austrian possessions are held on in Lombardy. So there is some sort of, again, dynastic empire which she can inherit. And
I read that apparently Maria Theresa she made an appeal to the Hungarian Diet, and it went quite poorly. So how exactly did she win them over? Because from what I understand, they were quite reticent, to say the least.
They were quite reticent to having. So you have to remember that Hungary had been, occupied by the Turks until relatively recently. So Hungary, as having like a continuous unit of territory, which is historically recognizable, has only existed for roughly 50 years at this point. So the idea is that they can use this as a launch pad for independence. And this was actually the expectation of many European commentators, that there would be this expectation of independence. Like I mentioned, there is this apocryphal story regarding her, doing essentially what Catherine the Great would do later, which is donning the dress of, I think it's a Hungarian hussar, and appealing to the loyalty of troops as if she were a man, essentially.
Yes, there was a... Now, this is something that I've read about in other places as well. I mean, you had... was it Jadwiga, the queen who called herself a king? You couldn't sort of be a queen. Quite bizarre situation. And
Absolutely.
So you'd have women with the title of king.
Yes, absolutely. And I do believe I've sort of illustrated why, which is this this promise of support for the Hungarian nobility, the promise of protecting their ancient privileges. I mean, essentially, had they gone independent, there was the prospect that Hungary would be involved in this bitter civil war, because there were many pro-Austrian families, notably the Esterhazy family. So rather than embroil themselves in the civil war, they accepted this situation where basically Hungary would be left alone. There would be basically even the right to attack Hungarian nobles was exercised.
And they accepted this with an eye to the future and future
Absolutely,
independence. Yeah. Yes, I understand.
Yes, absolutely.
Because it's also worth mentioning too, because I know we sort of breezed past it, but so the aftermath of Mohacs and those early sieges against the Turks, like the Buda and the early loss of much of Hungary, in the previous century and a half, when the Ottomans were still burgeoning. The Hungarians don't want to be in this position again either. They don't want to be sort of isolated from the Austrian throne, which can protect them in this context as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's something that you notice when you're reading as well, is that many of the Hungarian nobles sort of straddle this line, and at times are more nationalistic, at times sort of come back to the Habsburg monarchy as a sort of protecting force.
Exactly, because I mean, for them, this is still very sort of alive in their memory. It's a serious event that had occurred in the prior century or two. So it was still very much part of the Hungarian consciousness,
and extremely traumatic as well. I mean, when we get back to the Ottomans, we'll be able to cover some of that. But I mean, the way the Ottomans ruled the Balkans and much of Eastern Europe was almost unimaginably cruel.
Which, for the Hungarians, it's almost relief that it was as temporary as it was, and they weren't sort of mired in the same way that, say, the Serbs or the Bulgars or indeed the Greeks were for several centuries.
Yes, and you have to recognize one point as well, is that much of because of, again, the devastation brought on by the constant toing and throwing, the constant wars, basically Hungary was switched sides between, Austrian rule and Transylvanian rule and direct Ottoman rule continuously throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. As a result, central Hungary was devastated. So there was, right at the beginning of the conquest, there was a conscious effort by the Habsburgs to repopulate the areas, and this is where you get the so-called Danubian Germans, essentially the Hungarian Germans being moved in to repopulate these areas as well. And of course, they are loyal to the Habsburgs at the same time. So all of these elements come and contribute
Is
to this
this
idea.
perhaps you could clear this up for me, because I've been reading that Budapest, for example, in this period had a very, very large German population. Now, in any sense, were these German populations already there, a legacy of perhaps the Eastern Crusades and German trading towns that were set up, that long history, or was it really only at this time that Germans became a presence in Hungary?
Right. Well, Buda and Pest, of course, were still two different cities at this point. They wouldn't be amalgamated.
Okay.
But
that was obviously going to come up in the stream.
I can't win.
But you're half right, Columba. Regarding the Siebenbürgen Germans, regarding the Transylvanian Germans, they've had a presence there since the Ostsiedlung, since the 13th century. However, regarding the Germans in Greater Hungary itself, in the basically the Germans in the Alfold region, in the Trans-Danubia region, these were mainly the result of the 17th century repopulation with the Danubian Germans. So there are older German settlers and there are more recent German settlers. So
it must have been quite the movement of people to get the kind of population numbers that you have.
Well, we'll do bear in mind that when talking about the Great Turkish War, this is probably the most dramatic territorial sort of development in Europe in terms of change, massive expansion in terms of borders since the Battle of Mohacs itself, with the exception that that was going the other way. So this is essentially undoing, 200 years of conquest in the space of a decade. It's an incredibly rapid series of conquest,
and so there are many enterprising people looking to capitalize on the opportunities presented.
Yes, absolutely. But before this, we still haven't even gotten to the Austrian Empire yet.
I'm sorry.
So just to quickly summarize the situation of the Austrian War of Succession and Mary Theresa, we mentioned that Frederick II takes over control of Silesia, and this is an Austrian gain which is going to be bitterly resented, but nevertheless they lose control of this territory definitively up to this point, even with the attempt to regain it in 756. There are some elements again which are helpful to Austria. So I mentioned already the fact that Mary Theresa was able to win over Bohemian and Hungarian support. Well, the French take over the Austrian Netherlands, and in one of the strangest diplomatic incidents, quite similar to the miracle of Brandenburg when you look at Peter III and Prussia, Louis XV decides to restore the Austrian possessions back to them rather than simply annexing them. And of course, this is setting up the diplomatic revolution in which during this war, the Prussians and the French had fought against the Austrians, but during the next war, the Austrians and the French will fight against the Prussians, and it won't go well for France in either of those two cases. In the first case, France wins a victory and then relinquishes control of all of the gains. Yes. And in the second,
and of course, it's these crippling wars which establish the massive financial problems in France, and we all know what comes after that.
Yes, so this gets to the reign of Mary Theresa now at 1748, and she has begun to establish, control over this territory via the Pragmatic Sanction. Now Charles VII von Wittelsbach has also died. He died in 1745, and her husband
of gout, I believe.
Yes, and her husband Francis of Lorraine is now the Holy Roman Emperor. So the House of Habsburg, the senior House of Habsburg, has actually now died out, and we are now talking about the House of Habsburg Lorraine, which is going to be the house which continues on and forms Austria-Hungary. Now, in terms of trying to qualify Mary's rule, Mary ruled basically as an absolute monarch, despite the fact that she was still, again, she wasn't the Holy Roman Emperor. That was held by her husband, and the fact that her son, after 1765, was technically the ruler of all of these territories at the same time. Despite that, she was able to hold on and co-rule although she was very much the senior partner in this relationship with her son Joseph while she was alive, through the system of the Staatsrat, by which she essentially governed through her ministers, not as an absolute monarch, but as you see with Franz Joseph, she was content to pick ministers with which essentially she would rule, such as
it also seems to be something that's more common when you have a female ruler. Is that you will have a sort of a coterie of advisors around her. I mean, Elizabeth I in England comes to mind for me.
Yes, that comparison obviously comes to mind with me. The exception being that I believe that Catherine in Russia, of course, is ruling contemporaneously, and she is ruling, I would say, much more as an autocrat. Within the Austrian system, it's very much sort of the rule by the bureaucrat or the rule by the state official, as opposed to the rule by the monarch. As in with Russia, we have your autocratic state control, and through this use of the Staatsrat, through this use of the council, she appoints ministers such as Haugwitz, who begin to reform all of the irregular myriad composite armies into a consolidated Kaiserliche und Königliche Royal and Imperial army of roughly around 100,000 men. And she's also takes as a pains to undertake the creation of chancellery reform, bureaucratic reform to encompass the Archduchy of Austria and the Crown of Bohemia. She establishes the Hofkammer, or the Palace Chamber, for establishing a united financial control over all of these possessions.
And this is, of course, something which we've talked about a lot, is that when you have a ruler who wants to be more autocratic, or they want their authority to be more centralized, an essential thing to do is to shift the balance of power from the landed aristocracy, the great houses in the countryside, to a sort of imperial bureaucracy, usually centered on a city, be it Paris or, in this case, Vienna.
There is one exception to that, though, which, unlike France, in which the centralizing reforms are much more comprehensive, and we'll see that in Russia and Prussia, Mary is very conscientious not to overstretch in terms of a centralization. So when we're talking about centralization, we're talking about the core of the Austrian territories, namely Bohemia, Moravia, and the Archduchy of Austria itself. We're not talking about Hungary, and we're not talking about the Austrian Netherlands, and we're not talking about the Austrian possessions in Italy, namely Lombardy, the region around Milan.
And these also areas, Croatia, I think, was a dependency of the Hungarians, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and we'll get into the complicated relationship of Hungary later. So this reform is not uniform, it's piecemeal, and it's done to respect the existing ancient constitutions, which she herself was bound by, especially in Hungary. She does, begin this codification of the legal system which existed, albeit it's not an Enlightenment codification like the Code Napoleon. It is very much based on organizing existing medieval precedents, simply so that they are recognizable and they can be implemented more efficiently, as opposed to wanting to completely change the nature of law, as was the case of the French Revolution.
This is something which is really interesting in Austrian history, and you notice this later once you get into the sort of nationalistic period, I suppose, is that even when you have sort of liberalizing tendencies and the tendency towards that sort of reform, it's always couched in this in these ancient arguments about precedent and old ethnic and royal boundaries and what have you. And it's a really interesting way to see how these new principles are parsed through this bizarre system of prerogatives.
Yes, nevertheless, that system of prerogatives is bound with what you can say is this new system of government, which is called Cameralism. Now, when I refer to Cameralism, it still doesn't have a uniform definition. The etymology of this term comes from Cameralismus in German, which comes from Kammer, which means chamber, which is basically a pseudonym for state administration. And what this means is creating a more centralized bureaucratic class who periodically intervene in the economy to basically make line go up, to help the material conditions of the empire, to stimulate economic harmony between agriculture. The physiocrats were very prominent sort of supporters of agriculture, between manufacturing, whilst also trying to engender a supposedly enlightenment or moral administration.
Well, I mean, those two things go together, right? I mean,
yes,
because
exactly.
of course, I mean, you had Adam Smith and the beginnings of economic theory and labor being value, etc., etc.
What we see is the beginning of statistical government, essentially, during, and again, this isn't just a process which is limited to Austria, albeit it's a German phenomenon. This exists, principally in Prussia at the same time. There are elements of it, of course, which are also used in France. But this is where you see, you could say, the beginning of a Austrian bureaucratic culture popping up around Mary Theresa, who, of course, isn't just interested in improving the economic conditions of the empire, alleviating the terrible conditions of her people. So, for example, you have elements such as the corvée labor system. Of course, you didn't have salaried labor to a large extent in the 18th century. So peasants were required to do forced labor periodically.
Yes, you'd just be pressed into labor, essentially.
Yes, and so rather than abolishing such systems, Mary Theresa worked around to simply, alleviate the worst excesses of that system, essentially. And of course, she was a devout Catholic, and she was very interested in moral hygiene. So she created a so-called chastity commission to clamp down on vice, clamp down on prostitution, and of course she targeted Jews, she targeted Protestants for either conversion or expulsion, with one exception, religious group being accepted, which of course the Eastern Orthodox population, who were granted the declaratory rescript of the Illyrian nation, whereby they had special privileges which weren't afforded to the Protestants and the Jews. And essentially her early reign,
so based.
Her early reign is, corresponds to this attempt to either, expel or convert the Jews and the Protestants. But towards the end of the reign, there is this acceptance that economically they're incredibly useful to the empire. So essentially, she moderates her position, and also her son is one of the cornerstones for this moderation of policy as well. But what's important to note about Mary Theresa is you mentioned this this veneration, this empire steeped in these ancient legal precedents, and of course, what we see in Mary Theresa is this preservation of the Counter-Reformation spirit of the empire, which had been inculcated in it, ever since Charles V, and of course the Council of Trent goes back to the 1540s, whereby the Austrian Empire is basically the secular crux behind the re-Catholicization of the empire, albeit within the empire it doesn't succeed. Within its own dynastic possessions, within the Habsburg Monarchy, it does succeed, and what you see is a continuation of that under Mary Theresa.
This is even it's even represented in things like art and architecture, because I mean, one thing that you notice with the Counter-Reformation, I know this is slightly off topic, so I'll be quick. Of course, you have the Protestants with their iconoclastic tendencies and the sort of very restricted, severe style of art that becomes popular amongst Protestant merchants and such like. The Counter-Reformation, one thing that you notice is you see a sort of increased exuberance and dramatism in the art of the Catholic world. You get the Baroque,
yes.
Caravaggio, and this turns into Rococo, which Maria Theresa is a huge exponent of, and these all link into this sort of Counter-Reformation character.
Yes, and of course, in terms of the summit of Rococo architecture, this is expressed in the architecture of Vienna. So we see the Schönbrunn Palace in particular, which is the Austrian response to Versailles, all constructed.
It's a beautiful building
in the Rococo style. If you ever go to Vienna and go and see it, but she dies in 1780, having left the empire significantly better than the position in which she inherited. And against all odds, she'd been able to hold on to the empire. She'd been able to make an alliance with France. She hadn't been able to retake Silesia. Silesia would forever remain Prussian. Nevertheless, she had gained, as you can see on this map, Galicia and Lodomeria from the Polish-Lithuanian crown, because in 1772 we begin to see the decimation of the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania as Russia, Prussia, and Austria begin to carve successively.
It's not a good time to be Polish.
The beginning of the deluge, so to speak.
And that's also you mentioned that towards the end of her reign, she takes a more lenient stance on the Jewish population. One thing that I've noticed from my reading is that in much of the areas in the south along the Danube, you have Germans, and they sort of fill the bureaucratic role. They're the traders. They're the money lenders. Whereas in the north in Poland, there's not the same kind of established population, and so the Jews take on this role. And so she perhaps that's one of the reasons why she had to be more accommodating.
Well, yes, I mean, in particular, there are roughly the same amount of sort of Jews, I think between 5% of the population that were in Hungary than in Poland. So there were significant numbers of Jews in Hungary, nevertheless, but the highest concentration of Jews, is around the city of Lemberg, is around the city of Krakow, all of which will eventually become, core essential parts of the Austria-Hungarian Empire once we get there. So just briefly summarizing Joseph II, because Joseph II is the great anomaly when looking about the Austrian emperors, because Joseph II II wishes to rule as an enlightened despot in the vein of a Catherine the Great, in the vein of a Frederick II. And so in contrast to the pro-Catholic policies of his mother, in which you can say that Elizabeth is ruling in the tradition of throne and altar at the same time that Frederick II was becoming, much more sort of, you can say, even atheistic in his policies, even though he meant this, pretense of Christianity throughout his reign. What you see with Joseph II,
yeah, there's no respect for these old feudal precedents. He wants to centralize and rule as this grand Enlightenment monarch, but also a German monarch.
Absolutely, and I'll just expound upon this principle of Josephinism. So from the beginning, you have the patent and later the Edict of Tolerance for Protestants within the empire. You have the wholesale secular reform of the empire based on uniformity, very importantly, and centralization throughout the empire. You have literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, of edicts and new laws passed over his very short 10-year reign. Secular education is established, the so-called Josephine schools. Church land was secularized. He suppressed over a third of monasteries in the Austrian Empire, reduced the number of nuns and monks. He banned the Jesuits, brings marriage.
Some have argued that his control of the church was even tighter than Boney's when you get to the French Revolution.
Well, a lot of people love Joseph II, and they claim that he was more ambitious than either Frederick II or Catherine the Great, and I believe this is true. He tried to achieve more than they had in a quarter of the time, essentially. And as a result, by the end of his reign, I mean, just before we get there, we'll quickly summarize what else he did. He, in addition to bringing marriage under the control of the state, I mean, this is, you can say, the complete uprooting of the counter-reformation tradition of the Austrian Empire. You can say, the reason why it existed essentially was to be the bulwark of Christianity, and of course, the sole reigning Catholic emperor and the Holy Roman Emperor. Don't forget, he is still technically the Holy Roman Emperor. He was accused, I mean, in terms of like his inveigling, I mean, he got himself involved in the reform of the Missal. He got himself involved in the reform of the actual church architecture in terms of ornamentation. So much so that he was accused of having Protestant, if not anti-clerical sympathies, essentially. And it's also important to note that he patronized Freemasonry, even though he himself wasn't a Freemason. So the Freemasons were very happy to go along with basically what they saw as, completely compatible with their own goals, which is
he also freed the serfs famously.
Well, that's sort of selective. I mean, he tries to free the serfs. He goes about it in a much more sort of energetic way than Catherine the Great, who made all these great sort of claims that she would free the serfs and never actually did so.
From what I can tell, it seems to have been a more sensible policy that Joseph pursued, at least with regard to the serfs. I mean, because it was Maria Theresa, and she had brought through she had basically done a big survey or a census of all of the land, and she had divided it between I think dominical or noble land essentially, and rustical land, which was sort of peasant land. And Joseph, because what would happen, of course, when you free the serfs and end serfdom, many of the peasants will want to head to the big towns. Much of the land will be cleared, and you have all these huge problems. The creation of a sort of landless, rootless proletariat. Joseph tries to sort of allay this eventuality in Austria, and he does this by restricting the nobles from claiming rustical land. They're not allowed to, and this essentially the only person who could acquire peasant land is another peasant of wealthier means. And so it seems, at least to me, to be a more sensible and thoughtful attempt to relieve the condition of the serfs than what we see in Russia or what have you.
Yes, there were elements, however, which weren't so well thought out. I mean, we mentioned the introduction of corvée. He tries to abolish corvée labor, and he tries to reintroduce salaried labor for peasants. And this is a time where currency circulation is still quite minimal, and most of the economy, especially in the lower orders, is done through barter economy. So as a result, these peasants, but nobles were essentially ignoring this, and peasants were still observing corvée labor because simply the salaried infrastructure of the empire wasn't sufficient to be able to transfer corvée to salaried labor. I mean, you mentioned like the how he tried to introduce the abolition of serfdom. Well, of course, one thing which he fails to do is recognize the privileged position of the Kingdom of Hungary. I mean, again, you mentioned the consciously trying to rule as a German monarch. Well, there have been cases where there have been local vernacular language used in everyday administration, and of course, Latin was the main language of administration throughout the empire. So you still had Latin-speaking nobility. Of course, you had the diplomatic revolution with France, so many of the the higher orders still spoke French, the court language essentially, but most of the administration was still done in Latin. Joseph tries to reform all of this, so you have a uniform German language throughout the entire empire, including Hungary. So not only is Joseph expanding the centralizing reforms to Hungary, which his mother had never tried to do, and again stripping the Hungarian Diet of its privileged position, but he also tries to make the Hungarians speak German at the same time, and
it's not going to go down very well, is it?
So basically, it's a policy of trying to create a Deutsche Magyar, essentially. Sort of.
But they were already Deutsch Magyar. I think it's fair to say. But
true.
On a much larger scale, he's essentially this is what I mean by him trying to achieve something which is far more ambitious in a much shorter strain of time. He's imagining this secular, enlightened despotism, which is thoroughly uniform, united in language, united under these secular principles, united under the monarch. Without all of these ancient sort of historical relationships between peasant and feudal landowner. All of this is going to be stripped away and replaced with a simple top-down administration from the emperor to his subjects. And of course, this was incredibly ambitious, and it basically turned everyone against him. I mean, the peasants despised him because he would, say, for example, try and limit the celebration of saints' days, say, for example. So he was meddling.
That's not going to go down well.
So he was meddling. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go, Apostle. I'll ask afterwards. Sorry, keep going.
So he was meddling in the everyday lives of peasants. He was severely limiting the nobility's right. Again, when we say in France, when Louis XVI tries to, introduce, for example, his Council of Notables to encourage the nobles to pay taxes, the nobles simply decline him, and he goes around and tries to find another solution. We see a massive wholesale attempt by Joseph II to increase, land taxes throughout the empire to pay for these ridiculous wars against the Ottomans, which are going nowhere. He's severely trying to curtail their rights, and he's trying to implement these reforms everywhere. So you see a major reaction against him in Lombardy, in Hungary, and of course, in Hungary, he basically abandons all reform even before he dies.
Yes, and I mean his economic measures as well. They have this strange effect of sort of, because he wants this autocracy perhaps, or this increasing influence for himself. But his economic reforms and the rules around land tenure and the increase of the money economy essentially ruins or really threatens the prospects of the sort of the small gentry, the small noble who perhaps owns a small estate somewhere, but it helps the great houses, the great landowners, which plays exactly against this kind of centralization that he's going for. And in fact, the one place where these sort of middle gentry hold out is Hungary because of their special rights and privileges.
Absolutely. So all of this, you can say, a perfect storm of failure cascades against him. There is, of course, the revolution in Brabant at the same time, and of course, you had the French Revolution a year earlier. So he dies in 1790, a self-admitted failure. And again, I think it's due to the fact that you can view him as an anomaly. He was an enlightened despot trying to impose a autocracy which was fundamentally at odds with the entire historical nature of the empire. So, Marcus, I can hear you wanting to.
I just wanted to get this in because, I mean, we don't want to obviously create a tangent. It's just that something happens here which doesn't repeat itself very often in history. And of course, my sort of inner Byzantinist must answer this question out of curiosity, because we don't see often nations, and when I say nations, I use that term broadly, not in like a post Enlightenment sense strictly, but we don't see sort of entities such as this transform their language, or there's an attempt from the top down to make a new lingua franca of a country, of a nation. We see that obviously with Heraclius. We covered that, say, in our Byzantine streams, where when he moves from Carthage and goes to Constantinople, makes transforms the empire's language from Latin to Greek. That's one historical example of that happening. Here, Joseph, I mean, the Germans obviously have this preeminent, the ethnic Germans, I mean, like the Austrian Germans, have a preeminent position in this state, have done for the entirety of its histories, and will do up until 1918, 1919, when the empire is eventually dissolved. What about Joseph's attempt, say, would be different than, say, what Heraclius tried to do? Because there isn't too many historical precedents of this, if you get what I mean. This ability to sort of transform the lingua franca within a nation, and by
Well, I
essentially the
suppose
edict of a person, you
if we
know.
look at the Byzantine situation, he's essentially sort of removing the Latin and going back to the Greek that had already been there for a long time, with the Hellenistic empires.
Within its
Whereas
geography, yeah.
yes, whereas here,
Mm,
German doesn't have that long history, and in fact, there's a long history of German and Slavic and Hungarian contention, and so
mm,
one can understand how it's not so
Well,
popular.
yes. I mean, Marcus, the
mm,
reason he believed that German would be the natural language, I mean, he talks about him being a consciously German monarch. I don't necessarily think that's true. I simply believe that from a practical mindset, most of the German bureaucratic classes, the so-called Cameralissimus, were German speakers. And so he
mhm.
believed if the entire administration was to be done in German, it would simply be more efficient. However, these are German minorities ruling over vast non-German speaking peoples,
Mm,
unlike in the
mm.
situation of the Byzantine Empire, where you
Yeah.
had a Greek core, a vast Greek core, and
Mm,
then much larger Greek contingents, throughout Syria and Greece. So in terms of like
yeah.
the scale of the German population vis-a-vis all the minorities,
Mm,
there's no equivalent.
But
yeah.
it is also
Indeed.
you could also note that perhaps this is one thing which sort of encouraged Joseph in this endeavor is that German it wasn't an explicitly racial or ethnic thing, and in fact I have a little passage here written down from Taylor, which I know you told me to take him with a grain of salt, so perhaps you can give me your commentary on this. Do you guys mind if I read out this little paragraph?
Sure, go ahead.
I'd love to
So,
hear it.
so, so he says here, the German character of the towns, and he's talking about, all the trading towns, and bear in mind that urbanization was, it's almost as if class and ethnicity were linked in some sense. So the Germans were the people of the town, the Slavs were the peasant classes, and what have you. So he says
Mm,
the German character of the towns had little or nothing to do with race. Some town dwellers were Habsburg imports from Germany. Many were migrants from the countryside. German was a class name. It meant essentially a trader, shopkeeper, merchant, handicraft worker, etc. The enterprising son of a peasant Czech who entered a town, learnt a German art, and spoke German to his fellow shopkeepers. His children would despise his peasant dialect, and his grandchildren, safely arrived in state jobs, forgot that they had been anything but Germans. And so there's this idea that German is not explicitly ethnic or racial. It's simply, how would I say, the language of civilization, if you want to put it that way. And in fact, there
mm.
was an explicit link in the minds of many of these Enlightenment men with the expansion of Germanitas, if we want to use that term, and the Enlightenment. I mean, you've got to remember that there were no Enlightenment texts in Hungarian or Croatian. All of the Enlightenment materials that were coming into the empire were written in German as well. And so
Well,
there's
they're
this.
mainly written in French, but
Well, yes, they're written in French, but there's an extent to which they couldn't even really be translated into the Eastern languages.
There's an interesting point you bring up, which is, as you know, I've been trying very hard to try and disassociate any sort of ethnic identity, during this period and during this like entire sort of swathe of history. And I completely agree with you, Columba, that you can see that it wasn't ethnic; it was defined more by culture. And you can say that there is another group with the name for this, which is the Bürgerliche, or the town dwellers.
The town
And
people, yeah.
and these don't just exist in Austria at the same time. These also exist in Poland. These also exist in Russia. They exist all over Europe. But the difference is essentially is because, of course, there were vast German minorities in Livonia. There were vast German minorities in the Volga Valley, so to speak. So the equivalent would be trying to make German the official language of, say, southern Russia. Again, it's just taking this element, this town element, this urbanized element, and again, this is the result of hundreds of years of migration all the way since the East settling, the Osseidlung. And I simply believe that it's one thing to have a language and a culture associated with, you could say town administration or the town crafts essentially, but it's quite another to make this into basically like a class of elite who are going to rule over these vast people who again can't interact with the vernacular. It's one thing to try and assimilate yourself into this new class, but it's another thing to for them to become essentially a ruling class.
Yes, I mean this is an unfortunate and terrible trend of the period. I mean one could argue that the French Revolution is essentially it's the product of a tyranny mainly manned by the bourgeoisie, the urban well-to-do, and we see the same trends in the East, in Austria, of this class.
There's also
these town people taking over.
There's also another element. I mean, first of all, that's also an element which is aimed to undermine the fundamental role in administration served by the aristocracy, to consciously create this new meritocratic administration. Again, people who would only be dependent on the emperor, who can claim no other authority, which again is a crucial element.
They have no lands of their own.
Yes, and again, this is the way you have a deracinated German population, a bureaucratic class who are dependent on the emperor. But there's another element to that, which is in removing Latin as the language of administration. I believe, again, this is just another attempt to secularize the nature of the German Empire, to undermine its predominantly Catholic character at the same time.
Oh, yes, of course. That's a good point. Yeah.
It's funny, the point that you raised, Colin, but sorry, I'll be quick, Apostoli, just because it's a good quick tangent for etymology here. It's funny you mentioned that about the and actually you said the same, AM, about how Germans basically feel this sort of a combination of sort of a craft class and sort of like the burger craft and administrative class of the empire. Because if you actually look at German surnames, for instance, and this does obviously occur in English. We have surnames, for instance, such as Smith and Tanner and Taylor and what have you, Farmer, which are reflective of people and potentially at some point in time their ancestors having engaged in a trade of some kind. And this is probably even more common in German than it is in English. Like, for instance, if you have say like the surname Schmidt or Goldschmidt, that's a smith. A Kramer is a shopkeeper. Schafer is I actually forgot what Schafer is, but Schröder is Taylor. That can also be Schneider. That's the same thing. Shoemaker, quite famously, is a shoemaker, and these surnames live on into the modern day, and they're very reflective of a people, like this sort of ethnic concentration of people.
Yes, a nation of shopkeepers, we might say. But I mean,
shopkeepers, craftsmen, and burgers, I think is.
And this is something, again, you get this intersection of ethnicity and class. I mean, there are writings from the time where German speakers or these sorts of town people will explicitly refer to the peasant nations, and there's this idea that these other nations, they don't have these sorts of handicrafts within the empire, and you can really understand getting into the 20th century how all of this led to the the master race and all of that. So sorry, AM probably wants to get on.
Sorry, I thought that was an interesting point. That's all.
No, it's just an interesting point. I think again, just in terms of like the overview of the stream, I think we've been talking, like, for example, a lot about Hungary. I think the way that these streams are organized is that when we talk about like Austria in particular or Hungary in particular, we can really go into depth regarding all of these particularistic elements. So I hesitate to employ them, quite so much in depth in the streams, simply so again we don't. I mean, we'll probably massively overrun, but again, repeat too much going forward. So without further ado, we'll have to quickly go over the French Revolution report. So very quickly, the Holy Roman Empire is basically on its death throes. The French, under the new French revolutionary regime, have executed Marie Antoinette, who was the sister of the Emperor Leopold. Leopold dies in 1792, shortly following his brother. There's another little important point to note, that there are Habsburgs in Tuscany taking over from the Medici at the same time. This branch then is inherited by Francis, who becomes the emperor in 1792, and the French declare war on Austria in 1792, and this begins the French Revolutionary Wars. During this time, there is an attempt to reform basically the territories of the empire into much more consolidated stacks, which provide more and more men to defend the border town. This involves like the great mediatization of a lot of the church land or lots of the bishoprics within Germany. However, this is very much too little too late. And by 1797, the Austrians have lost the Netherlands. They have lost the left bank of the Rhine. During the campaign of Napoleon, Napoleon had also taken over Lombardy and established French presence there. And by 1802, France will have established its borders, its natural borders, the left bank of the Rhine of the Alps. And by 1804, Austria will have control over, Vienna. Venice has basically been, eradicated as an independent state at this point, and Austria takes over after Napoleon had dealt it the killing blow in 1797. Nevertheless, Austria and Britain and Russia at this time are now in a constant series of wars with Napoleon called the Wars of the Coalition. And in 1805, Napoleon launches a lightning stroke against Austria. He destroys the Austrian army under von Mack at Ulm, and he destroys the Austro-Russian army at Austerlitz. And this is a major blow to the empire because it signals the end, essentially, of the Holy Roman Empire. Before that point, Napoleon, of course, had made himself emperor of the French in 1804.
Which in and of itself is a direct challenge to the Holy Roman Empire.
And of course, I mean, even when the Russians claimed the title of emperor with the westernizing reforms of Tsar Peter the Great, this title was resented by the Austrians, who claimed a monopoly of the title of emperor. So
this goes back to the idea of universal
universal Catholic control, which is the possession of the Austrian sovereign, who is also the Holy Roman Emperor. So in 1804, it essentially looks as if the Holy Roman Empire is going to be dissolved. So in order to prevent himself being usurped, Francis takes the decision to elevate his lands to the Empire of Austria. And this doesn't mean, again, he's trying to create Austria into a nation, simply that he's elevating his own person and that of his house to an imperial house based on the possessions they hold, rather than the Holy Roman Empire, which, in the case of what happens to the Holy Roman Empire, Francis II himself dissolves it in 1806, rather than allow Napoleon to claim it under some sort of headship when he conquers most of the minor German principalities and reforms them into the Confederation of the Rhine. It's something which is very controversial at that time.
So would you say that by claiming this new imperial title, it's almost an attempt to pass the torch? Yes,
essentially, it's an attempt to hold on to an imperial dignity whilst the actual title, the actual institutions of the Holy Roman Empire are crumbling around him. And it is
Napoleon totally reorganizes Germany, much of Germany, famously.
Yes, and it's based on this contiguous landmass that you can see here in the east. And of course, things only go worse for Austria. I mean, Austria loses control over the Tyrol in that war. That's one of the core Austrian possessions that's given over to Bavaria. In 1809, the Austrians will attempt to reverse the situation in the War of the Fifth Coalition, and this goes disastrously for Austria. They are able to defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Essling, but they are defeated at the Battle of Wagram, and as a result, they lose even more territory.
Wagram, absolutely vicious battle. I remember reading about the Battle of Wagram. Apparently, some of the French soldiers took to urinating on the barrels of their muskets because they had been firing for so long.
Yes,
fun little fact for you there.
One of the crucial aspects of that battle, of course, is just you can say the lethal power of artillery fire. It was a flat field, and it was essentially, bellowing sort of artillery fire again and again and again, and it was just lethal. You would just have tens of thousands of corpses, strewn over these vast open plains because there was no protection for these artillery barrages. But
it's really where Napoleon, you might say, mastered his grand batterie, his mass artillery sort of tactics at Wagram.
Yes, absolutely.
One thing I would just want to quickly mention is, because you've more or less sort of covered it, but what we have with the gradual consolidation, so I would say, in Germany, and then with Napoleon bringing about the Confederation of the Rhine, essentially, even if there had been a survival of the HRE as an entity, the problem is the majority of the electors had been sort of extinguished at this point anyway. Yes, so in some ways, the Austrians.
Yes, with two exceptions. I mean, the majority of the electors, so we're talking, the electors of Mainz, the electors of Trier, the electors of Cologne, the elector of Bavaria. The Bavarian, well, the Palatinate has ceased to be an electorate by that time. It passed over to Bavaria, but Bavaria had aligned with Napoleon, so there was betrayal within the Holy Roman Empire against the Holy Roman Emperor.
And so, Francis being a sort of arch conservative as well, I assume he especially didn't want the Holy Roman Empire under Napoleon to become a vehicle for these French principles that he hated. So
absolutely. So the empire is dissolved on the Austrian initiative in 1806, and of course the last two contenders, which again could have resisted this, is the Prussian elector. Of course, he's still the elector of Brandenburg, and the elector of Hanover, who is still the King of England at this point. But obviously Hanover is occupied and it's temporarily given over to the Prussians before the Prussians are then defeated comprehensively at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in the War of the Fourth Coalition. So all of Europe is unraveling. Germany has effectively been subjugated by Napoleon, if not parts of it have just been outright conquered. And from this point, Metternich, the new foreign minister, so we'll get on to the next slide. Metternich, the new state chancellor.
Wait, we're actually moving slide.
Yes, we've been on that slide for about, I think, probably an hour now. Begins a policy of rapprochement with Napoleon, a policy of détente, and this surrounds the marriage of Francis's daughter, Mary Louise, with Napoleon, which of course produces Napoleon II. It's
the King of Rome,
the King of Rome, a successful dynastic union. And however, this, I mean, you can say this attempt to woo over Napoleon and accommodate Austria, the Empire of Austria, as a weakened ally in this new sort of Napoleonic world was premature, because in 1809 you have this diplomatic revolution carried about by Metternich to appease Napoleon, but in 1812 you have the disastrous campaign in Russia, which destroys much of the fighting capacity of the Grande Armée, and right from the beginning the Prussians basically defect from the French and join sides with the Russians. But the Austrians are tentative. They've committed themselves to Napoleon through this alliance and through marriage. And so throughout 1813, the Austrians prevaricate over whether to support this growing coalition. They eventually do at the Battle of Leipzig. Metternich tries to steer this course towards giving Napoleon some territory, some concessions, right up until the end of 1813, when it's clear that the momentum of the Allies is so strong after the crippling defeat of the French at Leipzig that Napoleon's defeat was now, virtually inevitable. You have
pretty much the collapse of Napoleon's continental economic system as well. So they're in dire straits.
Well, yes, the continental system had been designed as a way to defeat Britain by cutting off its principal strength, which was control of maritime trade. And of course, the problem with the continental system is that it necessitated this ever-growing French centralization and control over every single aspect of the economic and military. Of course, it gives Napoleon the impetus to massively expand the French state, liberally depose even his own family members, such as Louis of the Netherlands, and annex these territories outright. But it also creates him enemies absolutely everywhere, including enemies out of his former ally Russia.
Yes, because it's raising prices everywhere as well, right?
Yes, it's causing economic devastation across Europe. So Napoleon's downfall was predictable and earned. Sorry,
I was going to say, and that being also his main motivation for actually attacking Moscow to begin with was the enforcement of the continental blockade on Britain.
Yes, precisely. So all of this is now moot. Napoleon has been defeated and he's been sent to Elba, and of course he'll come back. There'll be the 100 Days Restoration, and then he'll be defeated at Waterloo and sent definitively in exile to St. Helena. And this is where we have the Congress of Vienna and the Age of Metternich. Now, I have a stream called The Age of Metternich, which covers this in much more detail, but suffice to say, Austria does very well out of this new Congress system. As you can see on this map, a German state is reconstituted in the form of the German Confederation, which is much looser and doesn't have the same, essentially, institutions and dependencies which the Holy Roman Empire had. And rather than restore the Holy Roman Emperor, Metternich and Francis allow for this institution, where basically Austria is the hereditary president as opposed to the Holy Roman Emperor. But in some cases, the reconstitution of the German Confederation is like a pseudo restoration of the Holy Roman Empire, with the Emperor of Austria at its head. There is also a much looser reorganization of territorial control in Italy. Austria gains Lombardy, back from the Piedmontese and the French, and it gains Venice permanently as compensation for the fact that Belgium, their previous possession, was handed over to the Netherlands. And just for a bit of context, Joseph in particular was very concerned that he wanted to get rid of Belgium because it was a extraneous province which was always, on the border with France. Therefore, it cost a vast amount of resources in order to defend against, possibility of French attack.
And essentially indefensible in that context.
Yes. So
yes, especially considering the situation in Germany.
Yes, I mean, his plan was to substitute Belgium for Bavaria, but of course he fails in the Bavarian War of Succession, as he fails in the Turkish War again. So Joseph's attempt ends in disaster. But Metternich is able, well, rather it's Francis's initiative rather than Metternich, to reconsolidate this territory in Italy, and of course this is augmented by Habsburg princes in Modena and of course in Tuscany. So the Habsburgs establish a hegemony over northern Italy in alliance with the Pope, who of course rules over a reconstituted papal states. They are the principal power in Germany, and of course they have virtual hegemony, economic hegemony, cultural hegemony, political hegemony over southern Germany, whilst there is a holy alliance between Prussia and Russia and of course Austria to prevent the rise of revolutions everywhere, whilst a Bourbon monarch has now been placed on the throne of France, who is now committed to and has a vested interest in repressing revolutions all across Europe. So we're talking about the creation of a European system aimed at eliminating any potential sort of revolutionary tumult ever happening again.
Yes, a sort of new dispensation. Yeah.
Yes, when we look at the Carlsbad decrees, these are attacks on Concordia groups, these are attacks on young European associations, attacks on Freemasonry groups, stymieing the freedom of the press, massive censorship controls. We have the curtailment of university freedom and university surveillance, essentially. All of these elements are designed to prevent the intellectual life to breed these potential, again, subversive sects who will undermine the integrity of this new conservative order under the nominal headship of the Austrian emperor, even though Austria doesn't have the military or the economic power to be able to dominate the system. It relies on its alliance with all of these major powers. Of course, Russia is the principal land power during this time, and Britain is the principal economic power at this time. And right from the beginning, Britain begins economically subverting this by aiding in the revolutions of the various revolutions in Latin America, and then very swiftly afterwards, you have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, one of the
English speakers funding revolutions in South America? No.
So, but I mean, one of the more controversial aspects of the Metternich policy, of course, is that Metternich wants to stymie Russian expansion at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. Metternich wants the Ottoman Empire to be preserved as a reactionary bulwark, despite the fact, again, it's not in this Christian conception of like the universal Catholic monarchy. And this is where you can see, again, the betrayal from the reactionary side from Russia, as when Nicholas I becomes emperor in Emperor of Russia in 1825. Nicholas, of course, is a major expansionist. He begins all these series of wars in the Caucasus, and of course to help the nascent Greek independence movement. And Metternich can basically do nothing to prevent the rise of this new, aggressive Russian power to the east. While in 1830, the Bourbon monarchy in Spain is defeated. I mean, there's even a quote in his diaries where Metternich says, basically, all of my work has been undone. So he's essentially he overextends himself in the fact that he's having to control all of these domestic policies of all of these individual governments of great power, such as France. But when the revolution happens in France, he's basically powerless to do anything about it. When the Russians begin this aggressive foreign policy under Nicholas I, he's powerless to do anything about it. When Palmerston is made the foreign minister or later become the prime minister of Great Britain, and Palmerston begins this, you can say, proto-neoconservative foreign policy involving the internal domestic disputes of the German Confederation of Italy and the Austrian Empire. He's basically powerless to resist Britain's betrayal of the fundamental principles of repressing the French, the restoration of the French Revolution. So all of these things are you could say attempting to undermine this Metternichian system, which is
you're running into problems in Britain with I mean you mentioned the Greeks and the sort of independence movement. I mean, you have the burgeoning Romantic movement as well. People like Byron, going over there, and so there's this a sort of lingering on of this the liberal ideas and the French ideas in the form of the Romantics and these new forms.
Well, it's actually funny with the Greek question with the Ottoman Empire as well, is that on one hand you've got these sort of romantic / almost sort of quasi-liberal movements that are coming out of France, post-revolutionary France and Britain, which are sort of propelling the Greeks and sympathizing with them.
Well,
on
I mean,
one hand.
what are the French and liberal movements? They're neoclassicists. They're Hellenists. They have this strong attachment to Greek culture and classical culture, and so freeing Greece is a very attractive prospect.
Well, this is the interesting thing, and I know this isn't about Greece, but I just want to stipulate this because it is an important point that a lot of people do miss. Is that on one hand you've got this sort of Hellenic harkening back that is being supported by Great Britain and France, but it is Greek seen through the prism of antiquity. It is a much older version of Greece, whereas just prior to this period, we've had all of the Orlov revolt of 1768. 1768 and 1770. That was just prior to the French Revolution. But the Russians, on the other hand, via this notion of sort of pan-orthodoxy and Russia seeing itself as Third Rome, as Moscow was the inheritor of Constantinople, the Russians themselves are trying to open up the straits, are supporting the Greeks, but
it's more. Just to quickly summarize that point, because we really have to move on. We're an hour and a half in, and we haven't even got to the compromise.
Yes.
Well, you're talking about the Greek plan. Essentially, under Catherine the Great, there is this idea. She names one of her son Alexander and one of her grandsons Constantine. Constantine is meant to be bestowed this essentially restoration of the Byzantine Empire, and of course, this is in tandem with the Austrians, who will gain massively as the result of the Ottoman Empire. This of course is one of the impetuses for the last Turkish war, but of course, as we mentioned, this ends in military defeat, and the Russians don't expand any further than the Crimea and Bessarabia. And as we can see with Metternich, this is a fundamental reversal of that policy, as Metternich is trying to hold up the Ottoman Empire rather than demolish it. Nevertheless, just quickly summarizing Metternich and what we're seeing on the domestic front, from 1825 onwards, Metternich becomes increasingly pessimistic as the system is routinely being subverted. The Hungarian Diet, for example, begins to exert this growing nationalistic sentiment, as all of these groups again are being supported by these intellectual circles which he's trying to suppress. He's trying to suppress the Italian, the Risorgimento, the proto-Italian independence movements in Parma, in Modena, in the Papal States. There's a rebellion in 1831 and a rebellion in 1832, which he crushes. There's someone in the chat mentioned the situation regarding Poland. Well, of course, one of Metternich's, you can say, his own betrayal of the system is that Poland is afforded some nominal autonomy under Russia as a result of the Congress system, whereby Congress Poland will be constituted in a personal union with Russia, not simply as a portion of the Polish state. Nevertheless, the Russians were ever trying to increase their control over Poland, and as a result, there were periodic, and increasingly violent Polish uprisings. And in 1846, one of the minor concessions made to a Polish existent state was the creation of a free state in Krakow. And in 1846, many of the subversives from Russia have moved over to Krakow, and Metternich has simply responded by annexing Krakow and inheriting all of those subversive, pro-Polish nationalist elements in Krakow. So in that sense, he was actually responsible for crushing the Congress Poland system he had helped, in fact, to create. But there's also the situation in Italy at this time. We have the election of Pius IX, who for some reason is anticipated to be a liberal and a nationalist. We have this idea of a neo-Guelphism, whereby the Pope would be head of state over a newly consecrated, Kingdom of Italy, as weird as that sounds. And in response, we have, martial law being declared in Italy due to this, growing Italian unrest at the expense of the Austrians. And at the same time, Metternich is going through a serious sort of, you could say, almost mental breakdown, a collapse during 1847, 1848, as all of this unfolded. And as a result of this, he fails to see what is the brewing sort of European tinderbox, which is going to happen as a result of, even after we have the February Revolution, which deposes Louis Philippe in France. All of these elements he still thinks are going to be localized to France. Of course, that doesn't happen. A month later, the Hungarians agitating for independence under Lajos Kossuth, one of the great sort of independence fighters from this period, and students begin agitating in Vienna. Even after all of these restrictions, Metternich is basically, lauded as, the great enemy, essentially, because he's responsible for all of these restrictive measures. It's important to note also that unlike Bismarck, Metternich never had complete control over the Austrian Empire. He was still very much dependent on the goodwill of Francis until Francis's death in 1835. And after 1835, you have this unenviable situation created by his death, in which his mentally handicapped son, Fernand, becomes emperor. And a three-man regency is created in order to oversee the affairs of the Austrian Empire. One is led by one of Ferdinand's brothers, Archduke Ludwig, and one is, of course, Metternich, and the other man is Koniggratz. Koniggratz, being the court minister, essentially, is always trying to undermine and remove Metternich from power. So there are two fundamental rivals sharing the administration of the empire, which frustrates Metternich at every turn. And so after the, you can have the massive altercation of the crowds in April of 1848. Shots are fired on students, for example, and this all it does is inflame further tensions. Metternich is basically thrown to the masses as some sort of peace offering. He's forced to go into exile, and Koniggratz is temporarily made state chancellor, albeit his victory is very fleeting because he's
so Metternich is the sort of scapegoat to sort of try and satiate the sort of new democratic nationalist movement that's taking over Europe.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'd say liberal, if not necessarily democratic at this point. Parliamentary, certainly, and definitely pro, Hungarian independence. And this is where we get to one of the reasons I've been hesitant to do like a heterodox episode on Franz Joseph is that Franz Joseph is so essential to understanding this period. So this introduction is going to include elements of a biography of Franz Joseph as well. So Franz Joseph was born in 1830. He was the son of Franz Karl and Sophie of Bavaria. You can see Sophie of Bavaria on the left. And the fact that he was, again, his father, Franz Karl, was considered weak, mentally unfit, unambitious, kind of like his older brother Ferdinand. One of the factors of Franz's sons is that they all seem to be uniquely incompetent. This generation inherited from Francis. However, with Franz Joseph is very bright, very intelligent, very I wouldn't say charismatic, but very capable from a very young age. And all of his mother's ambitions. Sophie of Bavaria is incredibly ambitious, incredibly intelligent. She focuses upon her son, Franz Joseph, as embodying the potential of the future of the Habsburg dynasty during the reign of this, mentally incompetent emperor, who inherits in 1835. And so he is put through this, grueling 50-hour, per week education regimen. He gains proficiency in French, in Latin, in ancient Greek, in Hungarian, in Czech, Italian, and Polish. I mean, can you imagine any sort of leader these days being able to speak all of those languages?
I mean, it's certainly a woman who has very high expectations for her son. I mean, even this portrait that we see with her and her son here, there's something of the Madonna and Child about it.
Yes,
yeah, there's that sort of element of the child being sort of almost portrayed as a bit of a cherub in a sense. It's like something there's quite a religious connotation almost in its expression.
Mm. And it doesn't just extend to languages. He's rigorously trained in maths and physics and history and law, and of course in politics and the art of administration. And from the age of 13, he's made a colonel in the Austrian army. So right from,
poor lad.
so right from the beginnings of adolescence, he's thrust into a military position to be raised as a soldier. And so when he's 18 at the point of 1848, he's basically the perfect person to take on control of the empire. And this is where the story of Metternich overlaps with the story of Franz Joseph. After the resignation of Metternich, Franz Joseph is actually sent to the front to fight, and he fights under Radetzky at the Battle of Santa Lucia in the First Italian War of Independence. Then, of course, you have the Austrian victory at Custoza, and the court basically believes it's safe enough after the original sort of tumult in Austria to move back to Vienna. Just for reference, Vienna is part of this pan-German agitation caused by the Frankfurt Parliament, which has been established Revolution 1848 to try and unify Germany under some sort of liberal parliamentary regime. The throne has been offered to Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, which of course he rejects, and the parliament has basically been slowly circumvented as all of the reactionary powers are regrouping and they're militarily taking back control of the various cities within the empire. And this, of course, is the case with the Austria, which of course up until then was considered to be the principal member of the German Confederation, therefore the leading German power. So the family goes back to Vienna, only again to be forced to flee, and you have the Olmütz court. And at the Olmütz court, the Austrian Empire is basically at a crossroads. If it doesn't fight this out, there's the potential that the empire could, actually collapse during this time, due to the fact the Hungarians are increasingly agitating. I'll mention the Hungarians in a little bit, but just regarding Olmütz, the agreement made in Olmütz is that you have many sort of military officials around Sofia, Bavaria, Ferdinand, and the young Prince Franz Joseph, such as Alfred of Graz, Prince Felix von Schwarzenberg, and the understanding is that Ferdinand must abdicate, and that Franz Karl, Franz Joseph's father, must renounce all his claim to the throne, in order for the empire to be led by a capable, young, energetic ruler who's also incredibly well educated. But pivotally, it's to allow for an emperor who has not sworn any coronation oaths. So he is not bound.
So he can appeal. He can appeal to all the different factions.
No more than that. It's that he's not bound by any legalities. He can do whatever he wants. He can crush the rebellion and not appeal to any of these established principles, such as a coronation oath to the Kingdom of Hungary, in particular. In order, when for example, Ferdinand is crowned, he's crowned, as King of Hungary and as King of Bohemia. The coronation oath involves many concessions regarding you're going to protect and respect the privileges of these ancient kingdoms. In electing and basically, thrusting this new prince in the throne during a time of complete civil strife, and you can say imperial collapse, the idea is that when the rebellions have been crushed, the empire can be comprehensively reformed without deference to any of these ancient customs, because there's been no oath taken, there's been no sworn statement to protect these systems.
So you can do this without losing face, so to speak.
Well, you'll still lose face, but it's more again the idea that a Christian monarch has taken an oath is much stronger, at least in that concession, that anything we can imagine today. But yes, the idea is that once you've taken the oath, you are bound by those conditions, and we'll see this with Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph's job now is to restore, fight for the empire, reconstitute it as, everything seemingly is collapsing around him. And of course, the Hungarians are aware of this. They're terrified that Franz Joseph can impose some new detrimental settlement on them. So they take the precedent of the abdication of Ferdinand to declare that they simply do not recognize the king. They hold on to this ancient privilege whereby the Hungarians can elect.
And this has happened
king.
Before. This has happened before, where the Hungarians refuse to recognize the monarch. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So the Hungarians refuse to recognize Franz Joseph, and the more sort of pacifistically minded government, liberal government of Batthyány, is replaced by the far more militaristic and revolutionary government of Lajos Kossuth. And Lajos Kossuth starts off basically as the regent of Hungary, and then by March and April of 1949, they are basically agitating for a full independent Hungary under a republic, completely, bypassing the Habsburgs entirely. And this was based on the so-called April laws. Now, in terms of understanding the weakened position the empire was on, right after the revolution, Ferdinand had ratified, and this is again why getting a new emperor is so essential, had ratified the so-called April laws, giving Kossuth the ability to turn Hungary into a parliamentary state, with the abolition of serfdom, the freedom of the press, and also the union of all the lands of St. Stephen. So this includes parts of Serbia, Slovakia, and Transylvania, part of Romania, and allow them their own army and their own foreign policy. So
and there's a strong strain of Czech nationalism running through all of this, right?
Magyar nationalism.
Sorry, yes, Magyar nationalism, yes.
Yes, it's not just Magyar nationalism, independence for Austria, but it's also Magyar nationalism in the sense that we're going to Magyarize the various minorities which exist within Hungary's, much more extended borders, especially when we
it's at this time that the Magyars the Hungarians begin to pressure the Croatians, who, as we mentioned, were a dependency, to switch from Latin and Italian to use Hungarian. And this actually is one of the things that drives the Croatians back into the hands of the Habsburgs.
Yes, absolutely. The Hungarians begin this because, of course, the weird state about Croatia is that Croatia is half in the lands of Austria because Dalmatia and Istria were part of Venice, and the actual core land contingent of Croatia, so-called Croatia-Slavonia, had been in a personal union with Hungary since, I think, the 12th century. And as a result of this, Hungary had, this dynastic relationship, this personal union with Croatia. But now the Kossuth government is trying to impose some sort of centralized administration from Buda on Croatia as well, which again is one of the reasons why the Romanians and the Slovakians and the Croatians go over, and again many of the Germans in Hungary as well, then go over to the Austrians. And so where am I? So again, the April laws, the fact that Ferdinand has ratified these obligations to the Diet is another reason why it's so important to get an emperor in who has made no such obligation to recognize the validity of the Diet in terms of this legal principle, this oath sworn before God. And so, Franz Joseph is now in an incredibly precarious position. Hungary is basically independent, and the weakened position the empire is in because of Hungary has led to the Piedmontese, led by the sort of revolutionary allied king Charles Albert, to invade the Austrian possessions and try and form a united Italy under Piedmontese rule, which is something they'll achieve successfully 10 years later. And this is where we have the Radetzky campaign in March of 1849, which culminates in the crushing victory of the Austrians at the Battle of Novara. And from this point of strength, Franz Joseph returns and appeals to the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas, to invade Hungary in concert with the Austrian forces to crush this rebellion, again evoking the idea of the Holy League, that the principle of this Metternician Congress of Europe is to crush these domestic revolutions.
Yes.
And Nicholas
is to defend Christendom and defend the classical dispensation that had existed. I mean, and again, it's drawing on this Habsburg idea of being the defenders of Europe, Catholic Europe, from the Turks, from the French, from these destructive forces.
It's worth mentioning in the context, because you just referenced Marshal Radetzky, is that Milan itself was a massive hotbed of this sort of new wave of sort of liberal-derived nationalism. And in fact, Radetzky and his forces were driven from Milan in what they call in Italian the Cinque Oggi di Milano, the 5 days of Milan. It was basically an insurrection that drove the Austrian garrison from the city at the beginning of the war, which leads to the Austrian counterattack, more or less.
Absolutely, and that's something we haven't really mentioned. I mean, you can say Milan as a hotbed for liberal agitation actually goes back all the way to Joseph II. But,
yes, quite. Yes, absolutely. I didn't mention it, but yes, now that you've said it, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have the fall of Buda in May of 1849, and Kossuth holds on to the nominal sort of headship over this new Hungarian Republic until he's forced to go into exile in August. And from there, Kossuth will go to the United Kingdom, and he will go to America, and he will try and call on American and British intervention to support the cause of a free Hungary. Of course, this never happens, and he dies in America, a long time later, I think in the 1890s. Nevertheless, in terms of the actual other leaders of the revolution, martial law is proclaimed in Hungary, and you have the ruthless putting down of any of the rebels, and these later become the so-called martyrs of Arad, the principal generals and supporters, including Battani, who had supported the Hungarian Revolution against the Austrians. And I mean, again, this is why it was so important to get Franz Joseph, because Franz Joseph, he becomes emperor. And at the same time this is all going on, in March, you have the convocation of the Stadion Constitution, which grants him exceptional power and centralized rule over the empire, and essentially nullifies the ancient Hungarian constitution and all of the rights afforded to Hungary, such as the right to elect their own king, and of course the Diet should be respected. And this goes back to the Golden Bull of 1222, just in terms of the ancient precedent of it. But this also goes back to the Pragmatic Sanction, which we mentioned, of 1723. So all of these historical legal precedents have been ignored as a result of you can say this very iffy interpretation by which Francis is never actually, the Diet was in revolt. They wouldn't recognize him as king. They didn't elect him as king. So you can say almost that he's a king by conquest at this point. And this is where we have this unique situation where the Diet of Hungary, which had been operating, continuously throughout this point. I mean, even when
yes, for something like what 600 years.
Yes, I mean, even during the Ottoman occupation, the Diet of Hungary had been split. You had a Diet of Hungary moving to I think it's Apulia Julia in Transylvania, and you had a part of the Diet going to Pressburg, which is modern day Bratislava, and Pressburg would become the center basically of the Hungarian Diet, as part of the possessions of the Austrian crown, essentially. But no, this situation where you can say this actual creation of an absolutist amalgamated monarchy in the early reign of Franz Joseph is actually unprecedented, and affords the young Franz Joseph, who has now arisen victorious over all of these revolutionary powers. He's probably the most powerful Austrian emperor who ever was at this point, even more powerful than Joseph II, because he's defeated all of his enemies. And he's still incredibly young, so he relies on ministers such as Felix von Schwarzenberg and his interior minister Alexander von Bach to initiate this period, which is known in German as a clerical absolutist, or clerical absolutist, throne and altar, and also it's known by the eponymous interior minister, Bach's absolutism as well. So this period corresponds with a restitution of Catholic education, fundamental alliance between the Pope and the Papal States in Austria, and again at the expense of these Josephine institutions, which we mentioned, these secular schools, which are which basically shut down. There is even harsher censorship, and as we mentioned, there are harsh penalties and executions throughout the empire.
And this all and so this strong reattachment and realignment with the church. This, to some extent, would you say this is a conscious attempt to destroy and slowly break down these nationalisms that have been so destructive by focusing on the unity that the church provides?
It's two-pronged. On the one hand, yes, it is basing on this unity which the church provides, which, as I mentioned, Austria as a counter-Reformation state gives it that essential unity, and it's harkening back to this essential unity which was temporarily broken under Joseph II. But it's also harkening back to the fact that Lajos Kossuth and many of the revolutionaries, including the Czech revolutionaries at the same time, the German revolutionaries, were seen fundamentally as anti-clerical. So it's simultaneously a unifying measure to get to reinstitute the Catholic Church as the embodiment of a unifying institution throughout the empire, but it's also trying to undermine secularism and nationalism at the same time, all at once, through this
and you can see how those go together.
Yes, absolutely, and again, a complete repudiation of the Josephine conception of autocracy, albeit it is a new form of autocracy which is established during this time. But what it needs to be noted that it's not just the political reconquest. You also have a major economic shakeup. So you have the creation of a uniform imperial custom system, which economically integrates the empire for the first time. Because before then, even
this is because you'd had quite a bizarre situation before, where because of the if I understand this correctly, tell me if I'm wrong, but Hungary had all these sort of special privileges, and amongst these privileges, the sort of Austrian half, the Habsburgs essentially couldn't tax directly the Hungarians, exactly. and so you had a situation develop where the Habsburg monarchs restricted the they didn't let the Hungarians buy goods from any lands outside of their control, and they also didn't let them produce a huge variety of goods, and then they raised huge import taxes on everything that the Hungarians wanted to import from the rest of their possessions, and so it was a sort of internal mercantilist control of a nominally independent Hungary.
Yes, you're completely right, which is finding these creative ways at actually taxing the Hungarians, and ironically, again, weakening them as both of these states form some sort of, again, mercantilism, or you could even say autarky at this point. So what you see is the elimination of these old customs barriers, creating this unified imperial customs system, which allows for a unified imperial finance system at the same time, which for the time is relatively liberal, eschewing much of the state interventionist cameralist policies which have been adopted adopted, by Joseph, and of course by Mary Theresa. So no, you're completely right. And again, this shows that in some respects, removing these ancient sort of historical precedents and privileges was actually to the economic benefit, at least, of the Austrian, now the rejuvenated Austrian Empire. And of course, one of the attempts made by Bach to undermine Hungarian nationalism is to support the loyalty of the Romanians and the Croatians in the empire by restoring their basically virtual autonomy within the empire, and giving Transylvania and the Banat, which of course had been the old military frontier between Hungary and the Ottomans, autonomy at the expense of this grand conception of the lands of St. Stephen. So all of this is again convoked to emphasize the centralization of the empire, and again award loyalty and punish the Hungarians for their attempt to basically secede from the empire. But of course, the effect of the empire isn't just localized to the lands of Austria. We've had the revolution in Italy, which has been crushed. So the former possessions of the Habsburg princes in Modena and in Tuscany have been restored. Of course, Pope Pius IX has been restored in the Papal States, and in Germany, benefiting from the confusion caused by the attempt of the Frankfurt Parliament to unify Germany, the Prussians briefly considered the Union of Erfurt to try and kick Austria out of the German Confederation 20 years before Bismarck attempted to do and achieved the same thing. And of course, under Schwarzenberg's leadership, this process is thwarted, and Austria restores its position as the hereditary president of the German Confederation, with all of the privileges which were associated with that. So Austria,
it's remarkable how after such troubles they come out on top. It really is.
Yes, but it's a very short period of time, nevertheless. But
yes,
sorry, Marcus.
I just want to say, just to correct a small mistake I made earlier. I actually meant to say cinque giorni, not oggi. For those who speak Italian, oggi means today, giorni means days, plural. So I got that mixed up. So just to straighten out my error. Yeah,
no, I totally noticed that. I'm glad you brought that
up. It would be unforgivable to remain in error.
Yes, of course.
Yes. And I want to mention, I've got an image of Cece up here as well, which is Franz Joseph's wife. Again, just talking, she's quite an interesting character in her own right. Sophie of Bavaria was anxious to restore much of the Austrian prestige in Germany, and so of course, she is a member of the House of Wittelsbach herself. So she believes that strengthening the Wittelsbach connection, because of course Bavaria is the strongest nation in Germany outside of Prussia, is key. So she arranges for the marriage of one of her nieces, who was of course a cousin of Franz Joseph, Helen, to marry Franz Joseph. And rather than do that, Franz Joseph actually marries the younger sister of Helen for love, Elizabeth, who was then of course colloquially known as Cece, over the objections of Sophie of Bavaria, which of course leads to a famous feud which goes on for nearly 3 decades between the two.
Oh, the Golden Boys finally disobeyed his mother.
Yes, and well, I mean, she was very young. She was 15 when she got married to Franz Joseph, and there was this expectation that she was completely incapable of fulfilling the duties of empress. She was unable to acclimatize herself to the court. She routinely suffered from depression and anxiety, or what we would know today, but in those days, of course, was referred to as melancholia. She was unpopular. She was unable to produce a son until 1858. And she was interesting in the sense that she was incredibly vain, I think it's fair to say. She was obsessed with her beauty and her appearance, as you can say, her famous brown locks, as you can see in this picture.
I was just going to say, I just realized, I thought that was a robe. I thought those were sleeves.
No, this was
her hair.
That has to be said, that hair is glorious, and women around the world should aspire to grow hair like that today.
I thought it was a fur-lined cloak or something. Well, there you go.
No, she embarked, I think she spent 3 hours on her hair every single day. It's quite incredible. But,
trad wives, take note.
Yes, but she's not really a trad wife. I mean, she was anorexic, and she was obsessed with exercise. I mean, she would spend most of her life riding everywhere throughout Europe, and which is not that involving Bercy inventing many of the first sort of early gym contraptions. But of course, she periodically has her feud with Sophie. She's one of her early children dies very soon after pregnancy. But from 1857. She becomes interestingly enough, an impassioned supporter of Hungarian autonomy during a visit to Hungary in 1857, and after that she basically becomes the royal champion of Hungarian independence and becomes the center of this agitation in the court of the Hungarian party, namely led by Julia Andrássy. And
do we
this
have
is where,
any idea what caused this change of heart? Was it sort of sympathy for the conditions of the people there, or?
well, this is getting into a bit of the psychology of Sophie, because she would periodically do this. She did this with Hungary, and later she would do this with Greece, where she forms an intense sort of romantic sort of conception of this period. I mean, she basically fell in love with Corfu and would spend vast amounts of time there, and then became a great advocate of the island, which was then part of Britain, being restituted with the rest of Greece.
Oh,
So
I
this
see.
so this romanticism, this alliance with, you can say, the particular nations of her empire. What's in particular about Sisi is the fact that she does take the Hungarian nationalism, as basically her preeminent nationalism over all the other peoples of the empire. She doesn't develop, say, for example, similar feelings towards the crown of Bohemia. In fact, after she's crowned Empress of Hungary, she decides to raise her fourth child, for a year in Hungary, basically living in Budapest, away from the court in Vienna. And this child is dubbed, the Hungarian child. So your Hungarian nationalism was, passionate and earnest. And this, I think, speaks to an aspect of Franz Josef's personality, which is Franz Josef is often characterized as, basically uncreative, dull, essentially, for lack of a better word. And I think his relationship with Sisi actually sort of shows how sort of ridiculous that is, because we have this, I would say, incredibly, romantic person who is obsessed with these ancient identities. This she in many senses she personifies the age of romanticism, and she didn't love Francis, but Francis passionately loved her and would profess so throughout the entirety of his life. So
yes, and one who was so sort of stolid and supposedly rigidly conservative and unthinking probably wouldn't have loved a woman like that so much.
Absolutely. So it's a little window into both of their psyches, I think. But nevertheless, this is the first sort of major chip in the system, this grand neo-absolutist system, which was established under Franz Josef. Schwarzenberg is now dead. Now it's Bach. Is we have the great betrayal of Russia. The expectation of Nicholas, of course, is that after you take over Austria, back over Hungary, back for the Austrians, that the Austrians will basically owe you, perpetual favors, when it comes to Nicholas's ever grand ambitions regarding the Ottoman Empire. Well, of course,
this is sort of in the Crimea, these sorts of areas, and it's also at this time that we have and it's also at this time that we have the sort of the great game that the Russians are playing as well, right?
Yes, and you could say the great game is the Cold War of the 19th century, and the Crimean War is where the Cold War gets hot, because the Russians destroy the Turkish fleet at Sinop, and the Germans try and basically they invade Transylvania and Wallachia and Moldavia, which had been autonomous princelings under Ottoman rule, and rather than support this, the Austrians basically oppose this. Then the French, the Piedmontese, and the British go to war against the Russians. And one of the only reasons why potentially Austria didn't go to war with Russia at the same time is because the Prussians, under the influence of the then Minister of the German Confederation, von Bismarck, positioned the German army in Silesia, threatening to basically compelling the Austrians and Russians into a neutral position, because
so the Austrians wouldn't be able to send any forces east, because they knew that if they did, the Germans would sweep in.
The Prussians would intervene. Yes,
the Prussians. Yes,
Germany hadn't been created yet. So all of these, so all of these elements essentially isolated Austria. Austria wouldn't find an ally again in Russia. Prussia already had its ambitions, starting with the Erfurt Union. And Britain, of course, had a schizophrenic relationship with Austria. And of course, France was entering into its revolutionary period neo-revolutionary period under Napoleon III. So this is getting to, I'm sure, your moment to shine, Marcus, which is talking about Solferino and the Second Italian War of Independence.
Funnily enough, I actually don't. I did some reading prior to regarding Solferino, because it obviously is an important element regarding the Italian story of nationhood. But interestingly enough, it was actually difficult finding battle maps that show the movements of the battle. And actually, funnily enough, it's one of the conflicts that no one online has really done yet, like in a sort of kings and generals context. But what is interesting about is that the Italians basically make an opportune alliance with Napoleon III in France, and the French support, because the House of Savoy is essentially a francophone ruling house in the northwest of Italy anyway. So the French supporting them isn't
There's a qualifier to that, though, I'd add, which is
Yes.
you say they're francophone. Their center of power was in Chambéry, which is in Savoy, which of course is French speaking.
Yes.
However, despite the fact they were French speaking, they were often vehemently opposed to the actual Kingdom of France, which they were almost constantly at war with during this time. But regarding their actual francophone sympathies, I mean, one of the concessions which the French make, upon the House of Savoy, is that they have to actually relinquish control over their dynastic possessions in Savoy and in Nice, and this is the so-called Plombières agreement, whereby the alliance is contingent upon the secession of this ancient territory, which basically surrenders the French-speaking parts of Savoy to France.
Yes, which causes a rift between Garibaldi and the red shirts and the government thereafter, because a part of the territory which was surrendered included Nizza, which is modern day Nice.
Which of course Garibaldi was a
native of.
Yes,
yeah, he was born in Nizza. So this is and a lot of Italians who didn't actually support the treaty were sort of irate at the fact that this exchange took place, because more or less what had happened here is that when in the context that the Italians, that the alliance would win, that the Austrians be forced to surrender their Italian territories, which they are after the battle. And the exchange would occur in that the French would be given Savoy. That was sort of the agreement made. But in regards to the second Italian War of Independence, so the Austrians attempt to obviously solidify their control over the area, because they have a defensive arrangement in northern Italy called the Quadrilatero, which basically means the quadrilateral fortresses, and this sort of exists on the border of Lombardy and Venetia, sort of along the Adige River, which sort of, for those who know World War I history, becomes rather important geographically, and so the Austrians sort of mobilize and send a portion of their army into Austria at the hands. I can't remember who actually commands the force itself, whether it's Ferdinand Maximilian or Ludwig von Benedek. I actually can't remember off the top of my head, but a couple of battles are fought in places such as Montebello, at Varese, San Fermo. Magenta was a large battle, but really the culminating battle, the most important one, which sort of determines the outcome of the war, is because the Franco-Italian alliance actually wins at Magenta as well. But the ultimate victory actually occurs at Solferino, and Solferino is famous for being a very grueling battle. It goes for something like 9 or 10 hours in a day. And although it isn't a battle which is famous necessarily for kill rate, what there is there's quite a lot of wounded. So, for instance, if you look at the casualty, so hang on. In terms of deployment, you've got approximately 120,000 Austrians, 82,000, 83,000 French, and about 37,000 Italians that are fighting here at Solferino. The French suffer just under 2,000 killed, and the Italians just under 1,000 killed. The Austrians suffer 2,500 casualties thereabouts. But what's noticeable is the wounded. So the French suffer 10,000 wounded and missing. The Sardinians or the Italians suffer approximately 4,500 wounded and missing. And the Austrians themselves suffer over 20,000 wounded and missing. And it's the outcome of Solferino which actually leads to the creation of the Red Cross. Actually, I think I might have mentioned this in a previous stream at some point.
Yes,
but
it was on It was on our Bismarck stream because again, all of this is
that's right. Yeah.
interrelated.
Yeah, but just to sort of offer context for people, yeah, I'll describe it as best I can. So basically, what had happened is that because the Austrians had to move sort of a significant amount of troops, and they had this quadrilateral fortress defense network, they were very dependent on the Milan-Verona railway, which had just been built, I think, in the 10 years prior to which. And for anyone who's travelled northern Italy, this railway ran along the shore of Lake Garda, and there's a number of towns that sit on the coast of it, Lontano, Rivotella, Pesceria, for instance. And what the Austrians do is they sort of anchor their right flank against Lake Garda and to protect the railway. And there's a series of hills, and if you actually go there, it's sort of, this terrain is actually quite defensible. And they sort of set up a line from Lake Garda as far south as the city of approximately Casa Marino or Volta, and there's a whole range of hills that sort of cross that range, and the Austrians dig themselves in there, and so the sort of the Italians attack from where the lake is sort of, so the Italian left attack the Austrian right alongside the lake. And what the French do is, because they're sort of deployed in four different corps, and they sort of attack in a very echeloned manner, hitting the Austrian center and then sort of wrapping around their right. And eventually the Austrian left, which is what is outflanked by Napoleon and his generals.
And so is the Austrian. And so the Austrian left, to the left of the Austrian left is the lake. Yes.
No. The lake sits on the Austrian right. I'm talking about the French right enveloping the Austrian left, which sits inland.
Gotcha. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and sort of basically that wraps around the town of Solferino, because Solferino is the town that's sort of the French center and left is anchored on. And what the French sort of more or less do is wrap their fourth and third corps around the Austrians. And what does cause this massively large number of wounded and of casualties broadly is the fact that the French are more or less attacking uphill, and they're attacking for hours and hours and hours. And meanwhile, the Italians themselves are actually fighting, because, like I said, the Italians are on the left, which is anchored on the lake, which is fighting the Austrian right, which is also anchored on the lake, and they're trying to fight over essentially the railway. And
I was going to ask you, because Solferino has a reputation for being an extremely brutal battle, right? Very bloody.
Oh yeah, like 9 or 10 hours. It was very brutal. And more or less what sort of happens is the fact that because there's all these landmarks, these little hills, the little hillocks, these towns, and because the Austrians are kind of sort of semi-entrenched or semi-dug in, the French and the Italians know that if they defeat the Austrians here, this will end the war. And the Austrians, in my opinion, are not far from they sort of, under different circumstances, you might say they could have at least fought a draw, but the difference is that just the French engage in sort of enough of a flanking maneuver to dislodge the Austrians from Solferino, and eventually, in order to not get caught, I think it's the Mincio River, which travels through Pesceria, through Pozzolengo, sort of directly south of Lake Garda. To not get stuck on the west bank of this river, the Austrians have to eventually break battle and retreat and use the railway line as a retreat.
Otherwise they would have been totally done for. Yeah.
Well, they would have been done for because they were being broken up on the outskirts of Solferino, and there you have it. And I can't remember. I should check the origin story. I actually did it in preparation for the Bismarck stream, but I actually can't find my notes for that, and I apologize. But yeah, the founder of the Red Cross, or the people that sort of would form the Red Cross in its initial sort of Christian sort of ethic mindset of tending to the wounded and to help people in dire need. Apparently the battlefield was just littered with bodies, and just the moaning was unbearable, and people in all these little towns, because this battle actually stretched for a number of kilometers, because you can tell from the numbers I read out before, this is actually a relatively large scale battle that's fought in northern Italy. I mean, you're talking the better part of there might be I'm just trying to think. I'm trying to run on the top of my head. What have we got here? 50. Yeah, so you got the best part of 120,000 men that are fighting here.
But they're stretched over quite a long line, yeah.
They're stretched over a long line. Oh, so sorry, no, you've got approximately 120 on each side. So you're talking like nearly 250,000 men that are fighting, and they fought a 9-hour battle, and so
Wow.
they're stretched over a number of towns. Like I said, you're sort of looking at a stretch of approximately, I don't know, 12 kilometers that they're fighting from Lake Garda down around past the actual town of Solferino,
and it would be difficult to imagine the suffering that would be on display, because I mean not only is it a huge number of men, but I mean, unlike say the battles in the First World War, which come later, this is still a pitched battle, and so you just have entire corps, entire lines of men just lying dead, and this is of course happening at the same time as the US Civil War, and so the technology has sort of jumped ahead a little bit, but not the tactics haven't.
Yeah, so this is 2 years prior to the Civil War, but basically the Civil War battles and these battles at Magenta and Solferino sort of fought in the same way. And actually at Solferino, you have the first sort of semi-en masse usage of rifled guns as well. It's actually
very high casualty rates. And we should mention for anyone who doesn't know, rifling on a gun is essentially when you will have sort of a screw on the inside of the barrel, and it has the effect of whereas if you have a musket that just has a smooth barrel, the ball can come out in pretty much any bloody direction.
What they call smooth bore.
Yes, smooth bore. But if you have if it's rifled and you have this screw, it essentially the ball will get itself into a spin, kind of like if you ever played rugby and you put a spin on the ball,
Yeah, it's a carving which is it's curved, but the lines themselves. I don't know if this is right, but sort of they're straight insofar that they're linear and continuous, but they sort of curve around the barrel. And what it does is it spins the brass, it spins the casing, and the bullet comes out the barrel spinning, and that increases its accuracy and its velocity by some measure.
And its range, right?
Yeah, it's range too, and again, you see this in the Second Italian War of Independence. You see this in the American Civil War. This is the thing, and also too, because we spoke in the Bismarck stream about the wars of the war in Denmark, and of course the the Austrian-Prussian War, and then the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. With rifling and breech loading, the kill and casualty rating of battles, the lethality index of battles starts to increase quite comprehensively, and we don't really see the full consequence of this until World War One. I mean, you have the advent of machine guns, which also increases the lethality index, but it's these quite groundbreaking technological advances in small arms that really makes infantry combat a real deadly exercise here.
And the tactics don't catch. I mean, you notice that in the period from, say, 1850 to sort of the end of the Civil War, the 1870s, you get a noticeable uptick in casualty rates. I mean, you have the Crimean War as well in the 1850s, which is famously...
Actually, I forgot that, yes.
Yeah, famously bloody as well. And you mentioned also the Red Cross. I'd just briefly like to say that, I mean, this is the advent of the modern world, right? And things become increasingly recognizable, and you're having the sort of Victorian tradition of charitable work and stuff taking off at the same time, and so that's why you get organizations like the Red Cross, Nightingale in Crimea, and what have you.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that's entirely true. Just on the small arms questions very briefly, is that even to some degree, like some of the initial plays of World War One are almost based on the assumption they're still going to fight the way they did 40 years ago. But then when they realize that with the sheer number of people they've mobilized, like this, the sort of the beginning of total war as a concept, and with the advent of machine guns and with the advent of magazines, rather than sort of loading one bullet in the breech, you've got a magazine of 5 or 6 or 10 bullets. Essentially this is why they start digging trenches in World War One, is because the lethality index has got so bad that you basically can't fight out of cover. It's literally deadly to fight out of cover.
Yeah, I mean, because because they could just keep firing. But anyway, AM probably wants to get on.
but yeah, that's the small coverage of Solferino for you. If
excellent, buddy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that, Marcus. So the effect of this is, you mentioned the effects of obviously Italy. Well, as a result of this battle, you have the first truce. And again, it's important to note that both Napoleon III and Franz Joseph are fighting this battle in person, directing the armies. And again, this is the last time this will ever happen, where two imperial heads of state will actually be fighting a battle against each other. Nevertheless, the effect of this is that, again, the Austrian under Franz Joseph have a particular contempt for Sardinia, Piedmont, as this hotbed of basically, you could say, revolutionary sentiment against the claims of the Habsburgs in Italy. So rather than ceding Lombardy to the House of Piedmont, Franz Joseph cedes it to France, and then France immediately cedes it to Sardinia, Piedmont. But again, this speaks to the French foreign policy interests at this point. The French had essentially gained what they hoped, which was assisting the Sardinians in territorial expansion, so they would gain their restitution of Nice and their restitution of Savoy. So they have no interest in basically assisting the Sardinians in the total destruction of the Austrian position in Italy. So the Austrians retain control over Venetia after this war for another 6 years. However, the later the Italians, at the moment still the Piedmontese, will later go and attack Modena, Parma, Lucca, the Papal States, the so-called Papal Legations, and they will establish, the Kingdom of Italy after you have the current expedition of 1,000 to form the United Italian State. But that's again a question for another time. Now, what's interesting about this is that as a result of this battle, obviously the Austrians are nearly completely locked out of one of their principal spheres of influence. Their traditional alliance with the the Modena and Tuscany, the Kingdom of Lombardy, Venetia, the Papal States alliance. All of this has been undone by this defeat at Solferino. So the empire now embarks on two things: a foreign policy reorientation, but also a series of major reforms. And it's just an interesting observation that this sort of thing exactly happens in France at the same time, with the reform of a Bonapartist absolutist government into a more liberal and parliamentary regime. The same thing happens with Austria. I mean, one of the effects of the Battle of Solferino is that the Austrian contingent, especially in Hungary, had been dependent on outward military power in order to, basically forestall any potential Hungarian uprising.
And so now they're totally weak, yeah.
And now they're not totally weak, but they're much weaker than they were, prior to the war. And so to preempt this, Franz Joseph begins experimenting with the constitution. And this begins with the so-called October Diploma, which creates a new parliament with very limited powers, basically a parliament convened of all the subjects of the Austrian Empire, to basically raise revenue, with the power of raising revenue. And basically kind of like the British Parliament, but unlike the British Parliament, it doesn't have the ability to legislate. All legislative initiative comes from the emperor personally. And of course,
so in a sense, he's sort of returning to the situation of taxation previously.
No, the difference is, as opposed to all these localized centers, these, you can say, composite parliaments, which would raise revenue in different ways, what he's trying to do is create a universal parliamentary system, as opposed to return to the previous, more particularist parliamentary systems, the various diets which existed before. Of course, this proves to be very unpopular, and so you have the new imperial constitution, or the February patent of 1861. It creates a House of Peers, equivalent to the House of Lords in England, and it creates a House of Deputies. And unlike again in Britain, kind of like what we saw in France during the Bourbon Restoration, it creates a system of indirectly elected officials through the Curie system. And the Curie system basically provides electors based on your certain social class. So members of the nobility have a certain allocated number of electors. Members of the urban chambers of commerce, what you can say the Bürgerliche, or the Germans within the empire, can elect a certain group of people. The professional urban classes, the doctors and the lawyers, can elect a certain group of people. And the small rural landowners, basically the kulaks of the empire, can elect another contingent of
that's a much better way of doing things, because from what I read, the situation with taxation, I mean, you had of course, parliaments and stuff before, but the situation with taxation, I mean, the Germans, being the sort of the townsfolk and the craftsmen and the merchants, were paying the lion's share of the tax. And so I mean, even in this period, I imagine you had disproportionate German representation in the parliament, but this would have slightly moderated that.
Well, the problem with the parliament is that it was originally boycotted by the Hungarians. So you had
Typical, yeah.
So you had German Hungarians go over, you had Romanians go over, you had Croatians go over, but the system was never able to find, again, universal approval. And so, but again, one of the other core features of this is that many of the local diets are reconstituted into what is known as crown lands, essentially. And this is basically giving over a new system of localized imperial administration where you have these local regional parliaments with a directly appointed governor, or more commonly known in Germany as a steward or Statthalter, to rule over these, various provinces. So, for example, the Austrian part of the empire after the compromise is divided into about 17 sections, essentially, and these they have varying degrees of autonomy. So, for example, the parliament in the Diet in Galicia, Lodomeria, the Polish and Ruthenian area will exercise far more autonomy comparative to Upper and Lower Austria, which are right at the core of the empire. So many of the constitutional precedents, which you'll see later with Austria-Hungary, are established with the imperial constitution, or the February patent of 1861. And of course, this brings us on to the foreign policy reorientation.
Just before you do that, it might also be worthwhile to note that one of the big factors that is put forward for this increasing nationalism and these increasing movements generally is of course, even in the age of the French Revolution, much of the sort of pamphleteering and stuff was restricted to Paris, restricted to the well-to-do. But in this period, again, with modernization, literacy is really taking off in a big way and expanding in a big way, which, of course, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand how that intensifies this whole process.
Absolutely. So what I've decided to do is, because of how long the stream's already run on, we're going to talk until the Battle of Koniggratz, and then we're going to call it a day for a stream, and we'll do a part 2 introduction next week, just because we're already 2.5 hours in and we're not all even at the compromise yet. So
many apologies.
But no, I mean, it's good to sort of flesh out as much as you can about this period. I mean, I was thinking about this even before sort of going on whether we split this into 2. So we will split into 2. So just completing this, as I mentioned, Austria was the hereditary president of the German Confederation, and using this preeminent position, Franz Joseph uses the opportunity of the defeat at Solferino to begin essentially lobbying the German princes for a potential real restructuring of the German Confederation, which would leave it slightly more centralized and basically transfer the title of the hereditary prince of the German Confederation into that of the German emperor, especially. And there is actually a committee which is organized as in order to serve this purpose. And it's frustrated because Bismarck has just been made in 1862 the minister president. He sees that this is basically the death throes of any sort of attempt of Prussian unification of Germany, and he prevents King Wilhelm I from joining this again potential increase in centralization of the German Confederation, therefore throwing all the plans, because without Prussia, there is no attempt, there will be no sort of practical opportunity of actually getting enough goodwill among the German princes to surrender their autonomy when the most militarily and economically powerful state outside of Austria is completely opposed to this attempt to reconvene the German Confederation under Austrian auspices.
So you need the sort of Prussian weight behind it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So this attempt obviously fails, and the Prussians under Bismarck again manipulate a war in Denmark with Austria, must be noted, with Austrian help. And as a result of this Austro-Prussian victory, the Austrians gain a possession in Holstein and Lauenburg, and the Prussians gain control over Schleswig. But contained in that peace treaty are all the elements which will basically, create the situation with the German Brothers' War, because the Austrians have essentially no interest in allowing, in holding this strategic area. All they want is to prevent Kiel in particular, a very strategically important city on the near Denmark, and again the basis of the later Kiel now falling into Prussian hands. So the Austrians agitate for the creation of an independent Duchy of Holstein out of the former territories carved up for Austria and Prussia, and the Prussians take this to be a deliberate provocation, that they're undermining the treaty, which from the Austrian point of view was almost to say Bismarck intentionally made it unworkable. As a result, this goes to the German Confederation. The German Confederation basically sides with Austria, and Prussia refuses to submit to this ultimatum. And in response, the German Confederation under Austrian leadership declares war. And as a result of this, most of the smaller princelings, with very minor exceptions, and many of the major German principalities, such as Hanover, which had now had a separate monarchy since Queen Victoria, having previously existed in a personal union with England.
Yeah, the Hanoverians. Yeah.
Württemberg, Saxony, Bavaria, of course, all joined sides with Austria. But unless, Marcus, you want to sort of repeat the Battle of Koniggratz again, if you're interested in the actual intricacies of the battle and how the Prussians won that battle so easily, I'd advise you all go and check out our stream on Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, which is the first half especially is dedicated to German unification. So unless Marcus, you have anything you want to bring up, I mean, there is also one talking about the Italian point of view, one fundamental aspect which I've ignored, which is the fact that the Italians and the Prussians have formed into an offensive alliance by this time, and this war, which also involves the Germans attacking the Austrians of Bohemia at Koniggratz, also involves the Italians trying to seize control over the last major possession which the Austrians have of Italy, which is, of course, Venetia.
Exactly.
Yes, and as a result of this, as a result of the German Brothers' War, the Germans demand no territory of the Austrians, but the Italians are able to seize control over the province of Venetia. And of course, the Austrians are shut out of German influence within the Confederation. They are kicked out of the Confederation. The Confederation is reconstituted as the new North German Confederation with the new constitution, which is going to be the basis of
and
the
this,
German
of course,
Constitution.
This, of course, lays the groundwork for the German Emperor, right, the Kaiser.
Yes, which will be created after during the Franco-Prussian War. So what we're illustrating here is that from, you can say, a very optimistic beginning at the beginning of the reign of Franz Joseph, after the crushing of the Hungarian revolt and the Italian independence movement, is that within the space of less than 20 years, Austria has gone from one of the principal European powers, and also the inheritor of this legacy, not only of Catholic Rome, essentially the legacy of Charlemagne, the legacy of the Holy Roman Empire, Catholic Imperium, but has also inherited the nominal leadership over Germany and Italy through the Metternician system. As a result of the disastrous first 20 years of Franz Joseph, and again, I'm not sure whether this could have been avoided because these are principally military defeats against far more organized powers. And of course, had it just been the Piedmontese against the Austrians in the Second War of Independence, the likelihood is the Austrians would have completely wiped out the Piedmontese, but it's the French agitation against the Austrians which is crucial, which allows the Austrian power in northern Italy to be broken. So by
I mean there are a couple of considerations as well. I mean, the Austrians are comparatively, especially compared to the Prussians, very short on coal, which at this point is becoming very important. They've not had
and very widely available in Silesia, ironically.
Yes. Which
I was just about to bring this up. Yeah,
and you also have you don't have the creation. Well, you do have it, but you have the creation of a landless proletariat far later in Austria relative to France and again Prussia, and so industry hasn't really taken off in the same big way, and so they don't have the same kind of capability to produce material. But there's also just the sort of modernization again, and the centralization that you had seen in Prussia, in many of the German states, but also especially in France, of course, under Napoleon. And so they have this extremely strong tradition of military centralization and military activity, which I suppose the Austrians don't have in the same sort of way.
Now there's one thing I'll qualify for that. All you say is true, I would say, in terms of consideration for much later in the time period than we're talking about. I mean, the German agricultural base, especially the Prussian agricultural base, I mean, Prussia was almost entirely, especially in the east, like an agricultural economy. The Ruhr Valley, etc., was an anomaly within the grand sort of system of the Prussian economy. And France was only recently industrializing. It had only really begun to industrialize 10 years before the Battle of Solferino. So what we're talking about are very sort of novel developments. When you're talking about the grand sort of contrast and the comparative developments between France and Austria, this is going to play a key role towards the beginning of the First World War. But you have to also remember that the war in 1859 and the war in 1866 were very brief. The Second War of Italian Independence against Austria was only 2 months, and the war against Austria was only 7 weeks. These are very short wars, and we're not talking about enduring sort of mechanized total warfare that we're going to see in the First World War. So this is the defeat of the already existing sort of pre-war Austrian army in both cases, rather than this being a case of economic warfare waged by.
So I suppose it's more the legacy of Frederick II and Napoleon that we're talking about here, as opposed to industry at this point. But it will become of pivotal importance, especially once we get to the First World War, of course.
So other than remarking that, again, Austria has now gone from, a principal European power to, you can almost say, a second-rate European power before the Ausgleich, that this is quite a good place to leave our conversation, because this is, longer than the usual stream, as much as I'd like to go on for another hour and a half.
and just to buttress what you said, like in the end, I don't think it's worth me elaborating on Koniggratz. Like, we did cover that in the Bismarck stream. There's no point really discussing it twice, other than to say that it was another example of another technological march, with the Germans utilizing the Drazer needle gun and breech loading rifles, and another technological evolution, whereas the Austrians in
addition to their mass mobilization using railways.
Yes, which was phenomenal, which allowed von Moltke to really bring to bear the full weight of the Prussian army in a very short space of time.
And of course, again, coal being key here.
Yes. Quite, and also just lastly, I don't know if AM you might be able to expand on this ever so slightly, but this Austrian sort of almost inability, or this hindrance within the nation to be able to modernize, in the same way that the French would engage in technological modernization with its artillery in the lead up to 1871, and with the fact that they were using rifled guns, and the the Prussians themselves that obviously they had the Drazer needle gun, and then would have breech loading artillery themselves, the famous Krupp guns in the Franco-Prussian War. The Austrians just aren't able to keep up with these developments that are occurring either to their west or to their north, with their chief rivals, and it really hinders them in their ability to fight these battles that erode the state.
Yes, during this time period, I agree with you. However, when we go on to talk about the actual sort of period of Austria-Hungary post 1867, Austria does go through, rapid expansion of their railway network, rapid expansion of their industry, their electronics, heavy machinery. I mean, there's even the argument that what was it? The Austro-Hungarian Mannlicher M1895 was actually superior than the German bolt-action rifles during World War One.
The Kar-98, the original Kar-98, yeah.
Yes. So would you put it down to all of these constant thorns in the side of Austria sort of retarded their development in these respects? I mean, I would put it down to that partially, but also, I mean, we must recognize, of course, for cultural reasons and perhaps other reasons, who knows? But the Germans have always had an extreme, stretching back to the prehistoric period, have had an extremely strong tradition of craftsmanship.
Okay. What you're arguing for is less Austrian retardation, but more regional. We're talking about regional disparities rather than general retardation. So, for example,
yes, Bohemia, the German areas are much more capable.
So, for example, Bohemia, the Italian regions, Tyrol, Upper and Lower Silesia, Carinthia, Styria, all of these regions were some of the economically richest areas in Europe. And of course, Vienna will become one of the richest areas in Europe. Whereas we go further east, when we go into Ruthenia, when we go into Eastern Hungary in particular, they are much less comparatively developed. So rather than, again,
Transylvania, Croatia, etc.
Whereas Prussia, there was a much that's less contrast in particular. I mean, there was of course contrast between the Ruhr Valley and the left bank of the Rhine compared to East Prussia, but not to the same extent as there was, say, for example, between Vienna and the military frontier, say, for example.
I put it down. I put it down to German.
Prussia was more uniform in that regard, slightly more uniform at least.
I put it down to German industriousness.
Just a quick point on this before we leave, I'll just because it's worth saying, because we'll obviously get to this next week, but just as a bookmark for people, that this is also a major reason why the Austrians become quite aghast at the breakup of empire following World War One, because, for instance, a lot of the industry was based in what would become today's Czechia or Czech Republic, around the cities such as Pilsen and Prague and Brno, etc. And the loss of these territories really has a deep economic implication for the Austrians, which is actually why, despite it being banned under the Treaty of Versailles, the Austrians initially wanted unification with Germany, if for no other consideration than A, potentially cultural, and B, certainly economic.
Wonderful, and that's a wonderful way to end our discussion, and give a hint as to what's coming next week. Sorry for people who are expecting again a full introduction, but as you can see, we're already 2.5 hours in. There was almost no way that was going to happen without us.
Yes, and Marcus is up at some ungodly hour. So,
yes, actually, just because someone said it in the chat as well, I did forget to mention Henri Dunant, who was the I just couldn't think of his name, but he's the man who basically conceived of the Red Cross and is responsible for the development of the Geneva Conventions. I just thought that was worth mentioning right at the end.
He was Swiss,
Jean-Henri Dunant. Yeah, he was French, a Swiss Frenchman. Yeah. Born in Geneva.
Wonderful. So, getting on to the super chats, which I missed from last week, which I found by going to scroll through the chat. Skelly Priest sent a $2 super sticker, so thank you very much. Page Unknown for $2. I'm in Wales tomorrow in a place Gawain pass through. Well, great for you. D's Bit of Rough for $2. Great stream, gents. Get your claymores out. Ooh woo. Jacob for $5. As someone with a Scottish name but descended from Longshanks on my mum's side, I'm torn, but not as much as Mr. Wallace. But okay, I get that one, Jacob. Thank you very much.
Nice.
Right now, do we have any super chats for today?
We have an super chat today.
Okay. John Boy for €10. 10 quid for Cece's hair. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad we could expose the audience to the majesty of Cece's hair and
the Rapunzel-esque locks.
And I second that. The spirit of that super chat. Those locks are wonderful, and like I reiterate before, more women should aspire for that. It's absolutely wonderful.
Italians love women with long hair. I don't know why.
Yes. It is irrefutably based, and I will never apologize.
Absolutely. So, are there anything you guys want to say or shill before we go?
Marcus, after you.
Oh, how kind of you. Actually, yes, I am going to appear once again on Unpopular Opinions tomorrow night. I think all going well.
Yes, of course. That promises to be fantastic.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the wonderful and interesting discussion about recent events. I'm sure most people in the chat will know that the puppet regime in Afghanistan has collapsed. So we're going to I think
thanks to the brave Mujahideen fighters.
Yes. Sylvester Stallone called it 35 years before everyone else. So good on Sly.
Are you talking about Rambo 3?
Rambo 3.
Excellent.
That's
so
where
funny.
The footage is from. So I believe it's going to be myself and obviously AA and John D, and I think Semigog is the other guest, so that will be fun. And I keep saying it just because we never quite get there. This thing with Semigog and I'm sure we'll get there eventually. About the hinges thing, we're still sort of nutting out details there, so we'll get there eventually, because that does offer to be quite an interesting bunch of streams should we get there. And I'm not terribly certain, but it looks like I will be talking with Mr. Patriarch about the state of for those who caught my first UO appearance about a month ago, I spoke about the sort of Australian economy and agriculture, and Mr. Patriarch and I are probably going to have a chat about that in the next week or two, so that will be interesting. Also, sorry, just Judge Caligula Bushman. Rambo was fighting with the brave Mujahideen against the nasty Russian eugenics Soviets, like he did. Basically, Rocky retired at the end of Rocky 4 and became a Mujahideen fighter in Rambo 3. So,
yes, yes, indeed, indeed. It's always interesting to see how Hollywood follows foreign policy.
The Ivan Drago to Kabul pipeline is real. Sorry, you go, Columba. Thank you.
No. In terms of shilling, I don't really have anything apart from AM and I on Friday, I think, might be doing a stream with Lambda about accusations that have been leveled about Christianity vis-a-vis the decline of the Roman Empire and degeneracy more generally.
Oh, I hope you guys do well there, because that is I find that very often in you might say NRX circles and beyond. It's used as the bludgeoning tool, and it's really inaccurate. I mean, I know we us three canvassed that a little bit when we spoke about it, and it's the lie that it's the Enlightenment lie that just doesn't want to die.
Yes, it's the Gibbon-esque lie, and hopefully we can take it apart and do the topic some justice, huh?
Well, all power to you, gentlemen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, both of you. And thank you to all my wonderful patrons for making all of this content possible. Thank you so much. If you have any interest in becoming a Subscribe Star patron, there is a link in the description. One last minute super chat by Judge Caligula Bushman. The running joke is that we know who the enemy is by asking who Rambo is fighting.
Indeed.
If he dies, he dies.
Very true. So yes, remember everyone to like and share this video. It really helps, and leave a comment. Thank you to my wonderful guests as always for being on such stellar form, and good night.
Night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Take